The morning began, as every morning had for the past 10 years, in silence and shadow, with Arabella Fairfax moving through the grand townhouse on Belgrave Square like a ghost who had forgotten she was ever alive. The March dawn filtered weakly through the tall windows of the servants' entrance, casting grey light across the flagstones as she descended from her attic room, her footsteps making no sound on the worn stairs, because she had learned long ago to move without disturbing the air itself, to exist without evidence of existing. Her hands, reddened from cold water and lye soap, carried the heavy copper water cans up 3 flights to the family bedchambers. Her back bent under the weight, her breath coming in quiet gasps that she suppressed because even breathing felt like an intrusion in this house where she was permitted to labor but never to be. The Whitmore townhouse was elegant in the way of declining fortunes, all gilt and brocade in the public rooms where society might observe, but threadbare carpets in the corridors where only servants walked, the contrast a perfect symbol of the family itself, beautiful surfaces concealing rot beneath. Arabella had once known these rooms as a resident rather than a servant, had walked these halls in muslin gowns with her head high, had sat at the breakfast table with Lady Whitmore and Lydia when she was their ward, their cousin's orphaned daughter, taken in after the fever, claimed both her parents within a week of each other when she was 16 years old. She had been Arabella Fairfax then, daughter of Emmeline Gardiner Fairfax and Thomas Fairfax, a girl with prospects and a small inheritance, and a future that seemed, if not brilliant, then at least secure. But that was before Lord Whitmore's investments failed, or so he claimed, before her inheritance of £8,000 simply vanished into the mist of his bookkeeping, before the morning after her 18th birthday, when Lady Whitmore had called her into the drawing-room and explained with cold precision that circumstances had changed, that the money was gone, that Arabella might stay in the household if she wished, but in a different capacity, as a lady's maid to Lydia, earning her keep. And what choice did an 18-year-old orphan have except to say yes and yes and yes until the word lost all meaning? 10 years had passed since that morning, and in those 10 years Arabella had not once been addressed by her Christian name, not once been called Miss Fairfax, not once been acknowledged as anything other than the girl or you there, or simply a gesture, a pointed finger, an expectation that she would know what was wanted without the dignity of being spoken to directly. She prepared Lady Whitmore's breakfast tray with mechanical precision, the teapot aligned just so, the toast cut into precise triangles, the marmalade in the crystal dish that was only for family, never for servants, and as she arranged the morning newspapers, she caught sight of her reflection in the silver tea service, a distorted face that she barely recognized, 32 years old but looking older, her chestnut hair streaked with premature grey, her eyes the colour of amber, but dimmed now, as though the light behind them had been extinguished slowly over the years until only habit kept them open. She looked away quickly because sometimes when she saw herself, she felt a terrible panic rising in her chest, a sensation that she was disappearing entirely, that one morning she would wake and find she had no face at all, just a blank space where a person used to be. Arabella, she thought to herself as she climbed the stairs to Lydia's chamber, her name a small rebellion in the privacy of her mind. Arabella Fairfax. My mother was Emmeline. My father was Thomas. I had a name once. I was someone once. I existed. But the words felt hollow even in her thoughts, because what use was a name that was never spoken? What good was an identity that no one acknowledged? And there were nights, deep, terrible nights, when she lay in her narrow attic bed and could not quite remember who Arabella Fairfax had been, when the girl she used to be seemed like a story she had read rather than a life she had lived. Lydia's chamber was warm, a fire already crackling in the grate because Lydia could not bear the cold, and the room smelled of rose water and the faintly sour scent of sleep. Expensive things and bodily things mingled together. Lydia herself was still abed, her blonde hair in curl papers, her face creased from the pillow, and at 28 she had the peevish look of a woman who had expected life to deliver certain rewards and found herself still waiting. "Do stop fumbling, girl," Lydia snapped as Arabella began laying out her morning dress, a confection of primrose silk that had cost more than Arabella would earn in 5 years if she were actually paid wages, which she was not. "At your age, one would think you would have mastered a simple corset." Arabella's hands trembled slightly as she laced the stays, pulling the ribbons through the eyelets with practiced efficiency, her fingers knowing the work even as her mind drifted elsewhere, to the garden party that afternoon, to the Duke of Ashford, who would be attending, to the small spark of curiosity she felt about a man she had never met, but whose name carried through London drawing rooms like a promise or a threat depending on who spoke it. "Oh, but then you never had proper training, did you?" Lydia continued, admiring herself in the glass as Arabella arranged her hair. "Father was too kind, taking you in like charity, giving you a position when you had nothing and no one." The words were calculated cruelty, a reminder of Arabella's fall, and once she might have flinched. But after 10 years she had learned to let such barbs pass over her like rain over stone, absorbing nothing, feeling nothing, because feeling was a luxury she could no longer afford. Lady Whitmore swept into the chamber without knocking, her morning dress of violet merino wool impeccable, her hair already dressed, her expression sharp and assessing as she examined her daughter. "The Duke of Ashford is attending today," she announced, her voice clipped and businesslike. "Lydia, this is your opportunity. He has recently returned from his estates and society says he is finally considering marriage at 35. You must be at your most charming, most agreeable. He is wealthy beyond measure, and his bloodline is impeccable. If you can secure his interest, it will save this family from our current difficulties." Arabella felt rather than saw Lady Whitmore's gaze flick over her, a glance of dismissal so complete it was almost violent. And then the older woman turned to the housemaid, hovering in the doorway. "Tell the girl to bring my shawl, the Norwich silk. I shall need it for the carriage," Lady Whitmore said, speaking as though Arabella were not standing 3 feet away, as though she were invisible, or deaf, or simply not human enough to merit direct address. The housemaid bobbed a curtsy and scurried away, and Arabella continued pinning Lydia's hair, her face carefully blank, her heart carefully blank. Everything about her carefully blank because blankness was safety. Blankness was survival. The morning progressed with its usual rituals, the family breaking their fast in the dining room while Arabella stood against the wall in case she was needed, the soft clink of silverware and china, the rustle of newspapers, Lord Whitmore hidden behind the Times, his jowly face occasionally visible when he turned a page, his expression perpetually disgruntled, as though the world owed him something it refused to deliver. Arabella studied him sometimes when she was certain no one was watching, this man who had stolen her inheritance and her future, and she tried to feel hatred, but found only a weary sort of contempt, the way one might feel about a rat in the larder, distasteful but ultimately just following its nature. After breakfast, she helped Lydia change into her walking dress for the garden party, a creation of leaf-green taffeta with blonde lace at the collar and cuffs, and as she fastened the tiny buttons up the back of the bodice, she let her mind wander to her attic room, to the small trunk under her bed, where she kept the few possessions she had managed to preserve from her old life. There was a miniature portrait of her mother, painted when Emmeline Fairfax was newly married, her dark hair curled fashionably, her amber eyes so like Arabella's own, her smile gentle and knowing. There was her father's watch, silver and heavy, the chain tarnished now but still beautiful. And there was a book, the collected poems of Wordsworth, a gift from her mother on Arabella's 15th birthday, the leather binding worn soft from years of reading, the pages filled with her mother's penciled notes in the margins, observations and thoughts that made Arabella feel less alone when she read them late at night. Arabella, she would think as she turned those pages, Arabella Fairfax, daughter of Emmeline and Thomas, a girl who loved poetry, who walked by the river, who had a mother who called her darling and a father who called her his clever girl. I existed. I was real. I had a name. But in the daylight hours, moving through the Whitmore house with her silent footsteps and her downcast eyes, it was hard to believe that girl had ever existed at all, hard to remember what it felt like to hear her name spoken with affection rather than cruelty or not spoken at all. The household departed for the garden party in 2 carriages, the family in the first with its crested doors and well-sprung seats, Arabella and the other servants in the second, a hired conveyance that smelled of mildew and someone else's cigars. And as they rolled through the London streets toward Hyde Park, she pressed her face to the window and watched the city pass by, the grand houses of Mayfair giving way to the green expanse of the park where the ton gathered to see and be seen. Spring was attempting to arrive despite the cold, crocuses pushing through the hard ground, trees beginning to bud, the air carrying a hint of something softer than winter, though March in London was never truly gentle. Arabella climbed down from the carriage and immediately set about her duties, carrying Lydia's shawl and reticule, staying 3 paces behind as the family joined the fashionable crowd promenading along the Serpentine. And she made herself small and invisible, as she had learned to do, a shadow attending her mistress, a non-person whose only purpose was to anticipate needs and fulfill them silently. She watched the fine ladies in their spring silks, the gentlemen in their perfectly cut morning coats, the children running with hoops and balls while their nurses called after them, and she felt the familiar ache of displacement, of being present, but not belonging, of seeing a world she had once inhabited now separated from her by an unbridgeable gulf of lost fortune and lost name. Somewhere in this crowd was the Duke of Ashford, the man Lady Whitmore had set her sights on for Lydia, the most eligible bachelor in England according to the whispers Arabella heard among the other servants, a man of impeccable lineage and considerable wealth who had somehow managed to avoid matrimony into his 30s, and Arabella felt a flicker of sympathy for him, this stranger who would be hunted through the season by ambitious mothers and desperate daughters who would be assessed and pursued and schemed over as though he were a prize to be won rather than a man with his own thoughts and feelings. But such thoughts were dangerous, were above her station now, and she pushed them away as she had learned to push away all thoughts that reminded her she had once been educated, once been fit for a different kind of life, once been a person who mattered. The March wind picked up, sending ladies clutching at their bonnets, and gentlemen steadying their hats, and Arabella pulled her worn shawl more tightly around her shoulders, the thin wool barely adequate against the cold, and waited for whatever the afternoon would bring, invisible and silent, a woman without a name, in a world that had forgotten she ever had one. The garden party unfolded with all the predictable rituals of the London season, ladies promenading in their finest spring silks while gentlemen offered arms and compliments, mammas positioning their daughters in strategic locations like chess pieces on an elaborate board. And through it all, Arabella moved like water around stone, invisible and necessary, carrying Lydia's Norwich silk shawl when the sun grew warm, producing her painted fan when the exertion of walking made her mistress flush, holding her reticule and gloves and the small parasol that Lydia declared too precious to actually use. The afternoon sun filtered through the newly budding trees along the Serpentine, casting dappled shadows across the carefully tended lawns where white tents had been erected for refreshments, and a string quartet played Mozart from a raised platform, the music floating across the park like something from another world, beautiful and untouchable. Arabella stationed herself behind a large oak tree where she could observe Lydia without being observed herself, and from this vantage point she watched the arrival of the Duke of Ashford, Sebastian Wentworth, who entered the park with the kind of quiet authority that needed no announcement, the crowd simply parting for him as water parts for a ship's prow. He was tall, she noted, perhaps 35, as Lady Whitmore had said, with dark hair that wanted to curl despite being severely brushed back, and features that were more interesting than handsome, strong rather than pretty, a face that suggested intelligence and a certain weariness, as though he had seen enough of society to find it tedious, but was too well bred to show it. Within moments he was surrounded, a flock of pastel gowns and eager faces, mammas pushing their daughters forward with varying degrees of subtlety, and Arabella saw the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes, the way his smile remained fixed and polite, while something behind it retreated to a safe distance. Lady Whitmore descended on him with Lydia in tow, her daughter's practiced smile bright and empty as a new shilling, and Arabella watched the familiar performance, Lydia's tinkling laugh at something the Duke said, her artful deployment of the fan, the way she tilted her head just so to display the column of her throat. All the calculations of courtship reduced to mechanical gestures that had been rehearsed until they appeared natural. The Duke bowed over Lydia's hand with perfect courtesy, but Arabella, who had learned to read faces in the margins of rooms, saw no particular interest in his expression, only the patient endurance of a man fulfilling social obligations he found tiresome. The music shifted to a livelier piece, and couples began to stroll the paths in pairs, the crowd dispersing slightly, and Arabella relaxed her vigilance for a moment, allowing herself to simply listen to the quartet, to let the beauty of the violin's voice wash over her like rain after drought. And she closed her eyes and remembered her mother playing the pianoforte in their old drawing room, remembered singing together, remembered when music was something she participated in rather than something she heard from a distance. The moment of peace shattered when Lydia's voice cut across the lawn, high and artificially distressed. "Oh, how clumsy of me! I have spilled lemonade all over my gown!" And Arabella's eyes snapped open to see Lydia standing with a spreading stain across the green taffeta, the glass tilted just so in her hand, in a way that suggested the accident was entirely deliberate, and Lady Whitmore was already gesturing sharply in Arabella's direction. "You there! Fetch the spare shawl from the carriage immediately, the rose silk, quickly now before the Duke loses interest." And Arabella understood at once that this was strategy, that the ruined gown was meant to give Lydia an excuse to withdraw and return looking fresh and charming, a second entrance to recapture the Duke's attention. She gathered her skirts and ran, her worn half-boots slipping slightly on the grass, her breath coming hard because she had eaten almost nothing that morning, and the corset beneath her plain grey dress was laced tight to give her the appearance of a proper figure, and she reached the line of carriages where the Whitmore conveyance waited, retrieved the rose silk shawl from the compartment under the seat where spare items were stored, and turned to hurry back. The path she chose was a shortcut through a more secluded section of the park, a narrow trail bordered by early crocuses pushing their purple heads through the hard earth, and she was moving too quickly, her mind already calculating how long Lydia would be angry if she took too long, when she collided with something solid and warm and utterly unexpected. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs and sent her stumbling backward, the shawl flying from her hands to land in the dirt of the path, and for a terrible moment she could not process what had happened, could only register the sensation of panic flooding her body, because she had bumped into someone, had caused a disruption, had failed in the fundamental servant's duty of not being noticed. She dropped immediately into a curtsy, her eyes fixed on the ground, stammering apologies that would not quite form into coherent words. "Forgive me, Your Grace, And only then did she register the title she had used, the automatic deference that came from recognizing expensive boots and the hem of a perfectly tailored morning coat. And the panic intensified because she had collided with someone of rank, someone who could complain to the Whitmores, someone who could cost her the only position she had in the world. "Please, don't distress yourself," a voice said, and it was a good voice, deep and warm and educated, with an undertone of genuine concern rather than aristocratic irritation. "It was entirely my fault. I wasn't watching where I walked. I came here to escape the crowd for a moment, and I'm afraid I was wool-gathering." Arabella remained frozen in her curtsy, her heart hammering against her ribs, and she heard the rustle of fabric, and then home to her absolute shock that the gentleman, the Duke of Ashford himself, she now realized, had knelt in the dirt of the path, heedless of his expensive dove-grey trousers, and was retrieving the fallen shawl. He brushed it off with careful hands and then extended it toward her, and she had no choice but to reach for it, her own hands trembling violently, and when their fingers touched as she took the silk from him, she felt something pass between them like a spark of static electricity, a shock of recognition that had no rational basis but was undeniable nonetheless. She pulled her hand back quickly, clutching the shawl to her chest, and tried again to form words. "Forgive me, Your Grace, I must. I should." But her voice cracked and broke because it had been so long since she had spoken to anyone above her station, so long since anyone had spoken to her as though she were a person rather than a function, and she could feel her composure crumbling like old mortar. He was still kneeling, she realized with mounting horror, still down at her level rather than standing above her as rank and propriety demanded, and when she dared to flick her eyes up from the ground, she saw that he was studying her face with an expression of curiosity, and something else, something that looked almost like concern. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question was so simple, so ordinary, so completely devastating that Arabella felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "I should like to know whom I have nearly trampled," he continued, when she did not immediately answer, his tone gentle, coaxing, as though he were speaking to a frightened animal. And perhaps that was what she was, a creature so thoroughly beaten that the smallest kindness undid her entirely. The question hung in the air between them, and Arabella opened her mouth to answer, to say the words that should have been the easiest thing in the world. "My name is Arabella Fairfax," but the words would not come. It was as though her tongue had forgotten the shape of them, as though the sounds that made up her name had been buried so deep under 10 years of silence that she could not excavate them in the moment when they were needed most. She stood there, frozen, her mind scrabbling for purchase, and all she could think was, "They call me." But what did they call her? They called her girl, and you there, and nothing. They called her nothing at all. She began and faltered. "They call me," but how could she explain that they did not call her anything, that she had no name in this household, that she had forgotten how to claim one? "I am," she tried again, but the sentence had no ending, because what was she? Who was she? The girl who had been Arabella Fairfax was gone, and in her place was this creature without identity, without voice, without the simple human right to a name. The Duke's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, a concern that looked almost like alarm, and he leaned slightly closer, his grey eyes searching her face. "They call you what?" he prompted gently. "Surely you have a name. Everyone has a name." But that was not true, Arabella thought with a clarity that was almost painful. Not everyone had a name. Some people were erased so thoroughly that they became blanks, spaces where a person used to be, and she was one of them. She had let herself become one of them, and the realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. "I serve the Whitmores, Your Grace," she whispered, because that at least was true. That at least was an identity she could claim. A function, if not a name. "I must return. Forgive me." And without waiting for his response, she turned and fled, the rose silk shawl clutched in her hands, her half-boots slipping on the grass as she ran. Behind her she heard him call out, "Wait, please!" But she did not stop. Could not stop, because if she stayed another moment in his presence, she would shatter completely, would dissolve into tears and truth-telling, and all the things she had locked away for 10 years in order to survive. She reached the area where the tents were erected and forced herself to slow, to smooth her face into blankness, to become invisible again. And when she presented the shawl to Lady Whitmore, the older woman snatched it without a word and draped it over Lydia's shoulders, already turning back to the Duke, who had apparently returned to the main party. His moment of escape ended. Arabella retreated to her position behind the oak tree, her heart still racing, her hands still trembling, and she pressed her palm against the rough bark to steady herself, to anchor herself to something solid and real. "What is your name?" he had asked, and the question echoed in her mind like a bell, like a summons, like a door opening onto a room she had locked and forgotten. "Arabella," she thought fiercely. "My name is Arabella Fairfax. My mother was Emmeline. My father was Thomas. I had a name once. I have a name still, even if no one speaks it, even if I have forgotten how to speak it myself." She watched the Duke from her hidden vantage point and saw that he was looking around the crowd with an expression of distraction, as though he were searching for something. And once his gaze swept in her direction, and she pressed herself more firmly behind the tree, terrified that he might see her, might approach her, might ask again the question she could not answer. But he was called away by Lord Somebody, drawn into a conversation with a cluster of gentlemen, and Arabella released a breath she had not known she was holding. The afternoon wore on with excruciating slowness, the sun climbing higher and then beginning its descent, the crowd thinning as people departed for their next engagements, and through it all Arabella stood and waited, and tried not to think about the moment on the path, the touch of his fingers against hers, the way he had knelt in the dirt as though her dignity mattered as much as his own. Lydia was in a foul temper on the ride home. The Duke had been polite, but not particularly attentive, had danced attendance on her for precisely the amount of time courtesy demanded, and not a moment longer. And she blamed Arabella for taking too long with the shawl, for failing to return before his interest wandered, as though Arabella's brief absence had somehow cost her a duchess's coronet. "You are useless," Lydia hissed as they climbed into the carriage. "Utterly useless. I should have father dismiss you and find someone competent." But even as she spoke the words, both of them knew they were empty, because Arabella worked for no wages and no lady's maid could be hired for free. That night, in her attic room, Arabella sat on her narrow bed and pressed her hands against her face. And in the privacy and darkness, she whispered the words she had not been able to say that afternoon. "My name is Arabella Fairfax," she told the empty air. "Arabella Fairfax, Arabella," and the sound of it in her own voice was strange and foreign and achingly familiar all at once, like coming home to a house that had been locked for years, finding it still standing but filled with dust and shadows. She thought of the Duke's grey eyes, the genuine confusion on his face when she could not answer his simple question, the way he had looked at her as though she were a puzzle he wanted to solve, and for the first time in 10 years she felt something other than resignation or despair. She felt a tiny fragile spark of something that might have been hope, or might have been simply the memory of what hope used to feel like when she still believed the world held possibilities for girls like her. Sebastian Wentworth had not been able to stop thinking about the woman in the park, which was absurd and troubling in equal measure, because he was a man who prided himself on rational thought and disciplined emotion. Yet for 2 weeks, the memory of her had haunted him with the persistence of a melody he could not name. He found himself distracted during meetings with his steward, during sessions in the House of Lords, during the endless round of social obligations that consumed a Duke's London season, and always his mind returned to that moment on the secluded path, to her trembling hands and broken voice, to the look of genuine confusion that had crossed her face when he asked her name, as though the question were in a language she no longer spoke. He had made inquiries, carefully and discreetly, about the Whitmore household, and what he learned troubled him deeply. Lord Whitmore was known to be financially strained despite maintaining appearances, his investments consistently poor, his debts mounting, his standing in society sustained more by the memory of past prosperity than present reality. Lady Whitmore was ambitious and cold, determined to marry her daughter well enough to restore the family fortunes, and there were whispers, never quite substantiated, about a ward who had lived with them years ago, a cousin's daughter who had simply disappeared from society without explanation. When the invitation to dine at the Whitmore residence arrived, Sebastian would normally have declined with a polite excuse, as he declined most such invitations from families with unmarried daughters. But this time he found himself accepting, his curiosity overriding his usual caution, and Lady Whitmore's reply had been effusive with transparent delight at having secured the presence of the season's most eligible bachelor. The evening of the dinner he dressed with unusual care, his valet noting with raised eyebrows that his Grace seemed particularly concerned with the arrangement of his cravat, and Sebastian ignored the implied question because he could not have explained even to himself why he felt this strange sense of anticipation, this feeling that the evening would reveal something important, though he could not say what. The Whitmore townhouse was elegant in a faded way, the drawing-room furniture slightly worn beneath its costly upholstery, the silver plate tarnished at the edges, the very air seeming to carry the scent of genteel decline. Sebastian was received with great ceremony, Lady Whitmore fluttering about him with compliments and offers of the best sherry, Lord Whitmore emerging from behind his newspaper long enough to shake hands and make ponderous remarks about the weather and the state of the markets, and Lydia Whitmore positioned strategically on the sofa in a gown of celestial blue that had clearly been chosen to complement her eyes. The other guests were minor nobility and wealthy gentry, the kind of people who could be counted on to spread word of the Duke's attendance throughout London society, and Sebastian recognized the dinner for what it was, a calculated display meant to associate the Whitmore name with his own, to suggest a connection that did not yet exist, and might never exist if he had any say in the matter. But his attention was not on the drawing-room theatrics or the transparent matchmaking. His attention was fixed on the periphery, on the shadows at the edges of the room where a figure moved silently, adjusting candlesticks, straightening cushions. And when she stepped briefly into the light to refill someone's glass, he felt his breath catch because it was her, the woman from the park. And in the 2 weeks since their encounter, he had almost convinced himself that he had imagined the strange pull he felt toward her, the sense of recognition that had no rational basis. But seeing her again, he knew he had imagined nothing. She wore the same grey dress, or one identical to it, her hair pulled severely back, her movements economical and practiced, and what struck him most forcefully was her invisibility. The way the other guests looked through her as though she were a piece of furniture, the way Lady Whitmore gestured at her without speaking to her, the way she seemed to exist in the room without occupying any space in the awareness of those present. Sebastian watched her throughout the evening with growing fury that he struggled to contain beneath his usual mask of aristocratic courtesy, watched as she anticipated needs before they were spoken, as she fetched Lady Whitmore's medicine and Lord Whitmore's spectacles as she moved through the room like a ghost, fulfilling the requests of the living. When dinner was announced, she did not join them at table, of course. Servants did not dine with family and guests. But she was present in the dining room, standing against the wall between the sideboards, ready to assist the footman, and Sebastian positioned himself at table so that he could observe her without being obvious about it. He made conversation with Lady Whitmore on his right and the wife of a minor baronet on his left. He praised the excellence of the turtle soup and the delicacy of the fish course. He laughed at Lord Whitmore's laboured jokes and appeared to listen attentively to Lydia's breathless observations about the latest opera. But all the while his true attention was on the woman in grey, waiting and watching for her name. The test came during the fourth course when a napkin beside Lady Whitmore's plate was apparently folded incorrectly, the linen not quite aligned in the elaborate fan shape that fashion demanded, and Lady Whitmore's voice cut across the table conversation with the sharpness of a blade. "This is folded completely wrong," she announced to no one in particular. "You there, did you set this place? Because if so, you have done it incorrectly yet again. One would think after 10 years you could manage something as simple as a napkin." Sebastian saw the woman's face, saw the way it remained carefully blank, even as something flickered in her amber eyes, oceans of suppressed feeling visible for just a moment before being ruthlessly contained, and he felt his hand tighten on his wine-glass with the effort of not speaking, of not saying what he wanted to say, which was that Lady Whitmore was a petty tyrant who deserved neither respect nor service. The woman, still unnamed, moved forward silently and refolded the napkin with deft fingers. Her head bowed and retreated to her position against the wall, and not once during the entire exchange did Lady Whitmore look at her directly or use any form of address that acknowledged her humanity. Sebastian filed away this observation, along with all the others he had collected throughout the evening, the casual cruelties, the deliberate erasures, the systematic denial of personhood, and he felt his resolve hardening into something that was not quite anger, but rather a cold determination to understand what was happening in this household, and why. After dinner, the company retired to the drawing-room for coffee and cards, the gentleman having dispensed with the usual separation, and port in deference to the Duke's known preference for mixed company, and Sebastian settled himself in a chair that gave him a view of the entire room, watching as the woman in grey cleared away coffee cups and straightened chairs and remained utterly invisible to everyone except himself. He waited until the evening began to wind down, until guests started making their farewells, and then he rose and made a show of patting his pockets and looking around with an expression of mild concern. "I seem to have misplaced my gloves," he announced to Lady Whitmore. "I believe I may have left them in the drawing-room when we went into dinner. Pray do not trouble yourself. I shall retrieve them directly." And before she could offer to send a servant, he was already moving toward the door. The drawing-room was dim, the candles burning low in their sconces, and the air smelled of beeswax and the dying roses that filled a vase on the mantelpiece, their petals beginning to brown at the edges. She was there, as he had hoped she would be, moving quietly about the room, collecting stray glasses and crumpled napkins, and when he entered, she looked up with a start of surprise and immediate fear, her body going still as a rabbit who has sensed a fox. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not mean to disturb you. I shall leave at once." But Sebastian raised a hand to forestall her. "Please do not go," he said gently. "I am the one intruding on your work, and I wonder if I might speak with you for a moment." Her eyes went to the door, calculating escape routes and consequences, and he could see the war being fought behind her carefully blank expression, the desire to flee warring with the impossibility of refusing a direct request from a duke. "I have attended many dinners, miss," he began, pausing deliberately to give her the opportunity to supply her name, but she remained silent, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. He tried again, more directly. I notice your employers do not address you by name. Is this customary in this household? She stopped moving at that, her back to him, and for a long moment she did not respond. And when she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. It is not my place to have a name, Your Grace, she said. I am a servant. The words hit him like a physical blow, the quiet resignation in her voice, the absolute conviction that she had no right to the most basic marker of human identity. And Sebastian felt something shift in his chest, a crack opening in the careful control he maintained over his emotions. Every person has a name, he said, keeping his voice gentle despite the anger rising in him. Every person has a place. Yours has been taken from you, I think. She turned then, and he saw that her eyes were glistening with unshed tears, her composure crumbling at the edges in a way that made her look both younger and infinitely older than he had first thought. Why do you care? She asked, and the question was not hostile, but genuinely bewildered, as though kindness from a stranger were so foreign to her experience that she could not fathom its motivation. Because in a room full of people performing elaborate social dances, Sebastian replied with complete honesty, You are the only real person I have encountered in months. Everyone else is playing a role, performing a part. But you are simply trying to survive with your dignity intact, and I find that more compelling than all the artifice of the ton combined. He took a step closer, careful not to crowd her, careful to leave her space to retreat if she wished. Please, he said, and he heard the note of pleading in his own voice and did not try to disguise it. Tell me your name. She stood there looking at him, and he could see the internal struggle written across her features, the decade of conditioning that told her she had no right to claim an identity warring with something deeper, some part of her that remembered being a person, being someone. And he waited with his heart hammering in his chest, because he knew somehow that this moment mattered, that what she said or did not say would determine something crucial, though he could not have articulated what. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of their breathing and the distant rumble of carriages in the street outside. And then she drew a breath that seemed to come from the very depths of her being, and spoke. Arabella, she said, so quietly he almost missed it. My name is Arabella Fairfax. The words hung in the air between them like something sacred, like a resurrection, and Sebastian felt an emotion he could not quite name rising in his throat, something that was part triumph, and part grief, and part awe at the courage it had taken for her to speak those simple words. Arabella, he repeated, and he said it gently, reverently, like a prayer or a promise, like the most important word he had ever learned. Arabella Fairfax, and as he spoke her name he saw something change in her face, saw her spine straighten slightly, saw her lift her chin just a fraction of an inch, as though hearing her name spoken aloud with respect and care had reminded her that she was real, that she existed, that she mattered. She was crying now, silent tears sliding down her cheeks, and she made no move to wipe them away, just stood there, with her name hanging in the air between them and her true self visible for perhaps the first time in 10 years. Sebastian wanted to say more, wanted to ask 1,000 questions about how she had come to this place, how a woman named Arabella Fairfax, with education evident, in her speech and bearing had ended up erased and unnamed in the Whitmore household, but he heard voices in the corridor, the party breaking up, guests departing, and he knew their moment of privacy was ending. Thank you, he said softly, for trusting me with your name, Arabella. I shall not forget it. And then he collected his gloves, which he had deliberately left on a side table earlier in the evening, and moved toward the door. As he passed her, he paused and spoke quietly, so that only she could hear. "You deserve better than this, Arabella Fairfax, and I intend to discover how you came to be here and what might be done to restore what has been taken from you." She looked up at him with wide eyes, shock and fear, and something that might have been hope warring in her expression. But before she could respond, he was gone, striding back into the corridor and toward the entrance hall where Lady Whitmore was bidding farewell to her guests. The Duke thanked his hostess with perfect courtesy, complimented the excellence of her table, and made vague noises about future engagements that committed him to nothing, and all the while his mind was turning over the name he had learned, Arabella Fairfax, repeating it to himself like a talisman. In the carriage rolling through the dark London streets toward his own residence, Sebastian sat in the shadows and thought about amber eyes and silent tears, about a woman who had forgotten her own name until a stranger asked for it, and he made himself a promise that he would not rest until he understood the full story of how Arabella Fairfax had been erased and what it would take to make her visible again. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March when the sky was the colour of pewter and a cold rain drummed against the windows of the Whitmore townhouse, and Arabella was in the scullery helping the kitchen maid scrub pots when the butler appeared in the doorway with an expression of puzzled disapproval. "There is a delivery," he announced, his tone suggesting that deliveries were inherently suspect, addressed to a Miss Arabella Fairfax in care of this residence. "Does anyone know of such a person?" Arabella's hands went still in the washing water, her heart beginning to pound with a force that made her dizzy, because no one had sent her anything in 10 years, no one had addressed her by name in 10 years, and the very fact of a package with her full name written upon it felt like a validation of her existence that was almost too overwhelming to comprehend. The other servants turned to look at her, the cook and the scullery maid and the 2 housemaids, and she saw recognition in their faces because they all knew who she really was, had always known even if they were forbidden to speak of it, and the cook gave a small nod of encouragement that made Arabella's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That would be me," she said quietly, her voice barely steady. "I am Arabella Fairfax." The butler's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing, merely handed her the package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and Arabella took it with trembling hands and carried it up the back stairs to her attic room because she could not bear to open it in front of witnesses, could not risk having this moment, whatever it was, observed and judged and potentially taken from her. In the privacy of her narrow room, she sat on the edge of her bed and carefully untied the string, unwrapped the paper, and found herself looking at a book bound in the most beautiful leather she had ever seen, deep green morocco with gilt lettering on the spine. The Complete Poetical Works of William Wordsworth, the title read, and tucked inside the front cover was a card in a bold masculine hand that said simply, "For Miss Arabella Fairfax, who deserves beautiful things, with the compliments of the Duke of Ashford." She ran her fingers over the leather, feeling the quality of it, the craftsmanship. And then she opened the book, and the scent of new paper and fine binding rose up to meet her, and for a moment she could not breathe for the joy of it, the sheer overwhelming joy of being seen, being remembered, being given something precious simply because someone thought she deserved it. She turned to her favorite poem, Tintern Abbey, and began to read, and the words were the same words she had read in her mother's old volume hidden under her mattress. But they looked different in this beautiful edition, looked somehow more real, more valid, and she felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she read about the still sad music of humanity and the sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. She did not hear the door open, did not hear the footsteps on the stairs, and the first indication she had that she was no longer alone was Lady Whitmore's voice cutting through the room like a whip. "What is that?" the older woman demanded, and Arabella looked up to find Lady Whitmore standing in the doorway with Lydia behind her, both of them staring at the book in Arabella's hands with expressions of outrage and something that looked almost like fear. "It is a gift, my lady," Arabella said, rising to her feet and instinctively holding the book behind her back as though she could protect it from what was coming. "A gift," Lady Whitmore repeated, her voice rising. "A gift from whom? What gentleman sends gifts to a servant? Bring that here at once." Arabella hesitated for a fatal second, and then Lady Whitmore was crossing the room and snatching the book from her hands, and Arabella watched in horror as the older woman examined it, saw the card tucked inside, read the inscription, and her face went white, and then red with fury. "The Duke of Ashford," Lady Whitmore hissed. "You have been receiving attentions from the Duke of Ashford. Who do you think you are, receiving gifts from gentlemen? Have you been whoring yourself to him? Is that it? Using your position in this house to attract his notice and offer him your availability?" The accusation was so vile, so utterly false and cruel, that Arabella felt something inside her snap, a cord that had been pulled taut for 10 years suddenly breaking, and before she could stop herself, words were pouring out of her mouth, words she had not dared to speak in a decade. "I have done nothing wrong," she said, and her voice was shaking but clear. "I have done nothing to encourage the Duke's attention beyond existing in his presence. He is a kind man who noticed I exist, something this family has not done in 10 years. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of rain against the window and Arabella's ragged breathing, and she saw shock ripple across Lady Whitmore's face, followed by a rage so pure it was almost incandescent. "You forget yourself, girl," Lady Whitmore said, her voice low and venomous. "We took you in when you had nothing. When your parents died and left you penniless, we gave you a home and employment. This is how you repay our charity, by tempting a duke with your—" She paused, searching for words cutting enough to wound. "With your aging charms and your presumption." Something broke loose in Arabella then, 10 years of silence and submission and swallowed rage. And she heard herself speaking words she had never intended to say aloud, truths that had festered in the darkness of her silence. "You took me in, and then you took everything from me," she said, and her voice was steady now, hard as stone. "My inheritance, my name, my life. I was 18 years old. I trusted you. I believed you when you said the money was gone, when you said I should be grateful for a position in your household. But I was not penniless. My parents left me £8,000. Where did it go? My lady, where did my mother's money go?" Lady Whitmore's hand came up fast and cracked across Arabella's cheek with enough force to snap her head to the side, and the pain was sharp and bright and somehow clarifying, and Arabella raised her hand to her burning cheek and looked at the woman who had stolen her life and felt no fear, only a cold, clear certainty that something had changed irrevocably, that she had spoken and could not unspeak, had claimed her name and her history and could not unclaim them. "Your inheritance was spent on your upkeep, you ungrateful wretch," Lady Whitmore spat. 10 years of food and shelter and clothing, that is where your precious inheritance went. My inheritance could have supported me for life," Arabella replied, her voice quiet but implacable. "It could have provided me with an independent living, with the ability to choose my own path. You took that from me, and you gave me servitude in its place. You erased my name and made me invisible, and I let you because I was young and frightened and alone. But I am not that girl any more." Lady Whitmore clutched the book to her chest, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. "You will apologize this instant," she said. "You will get on your knees and beg my forgiveness for your insolence, and you will burn this book in the kitchen fire. And if you do so, I may may allow you to remain in this household, but if you refuse, you will leave at once, without references and without a penny to your name. Do you understand me?" Arabella looked at the book in Lady Whitmore's hands, at the beautiful green leather and the gilt lettering, at the symbol of her name and her existence and someone's kindness, and she felt the choice before her like a physical weight. She could apologize, could abase herself one more time, could watch the book burn and retreat back into silence and invisibility, could survive as she had survived for 10 years by making herself nothing. Or she could hold on to what she had reclaimed, her voice and her name, and her right to exist, and face whatever consequences came. Before she could speak, before she could make the choice that would determine everything that followed, there was a commotion from below, the sound of the front door opening, the butler's voice raised in surprise, and then footsteps on the main staircase, rapid and purposeful. Lady Whitmore turned toward the door just as Lord Whitmore appeared, his face flushed with agitation. "The Duke of Ashford is here," he announced, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. "He has called on some pretext of business and is asking for you in the drawing-room. He is asking—" his voice dropped to a hiss, "about a Miss Fairfax and whether she received a book he sent." Lady Whitmore's face went through several interesting transformations, fury giving way to calculation, giving way to a forced smile that looked more like a grimace. "Lydia," she said sharply, "go down and entertain his grace. Tell him I shall be there momentarily. You?" She gestured at Arabella without looking at her directly. "You will remain here and not show your face. Do you understand? You will stay in this room until I decide what is to be done with you." She swept from the room with the book still clutched in her hands, Lydia following, and Lord Whitmore paused in the doorway to give Arabella a look of such venom that she took an involuntary step backward. "You have destroyed this family's prospects," he said quietly. "Whatever relationship we might have built with the Duke is now tainted by your presumption. I hope you are satisfied." Then he too was gone, and Arabella was left alone in her attic room with her burning cheek and her racing heart, and the terrible exhilaration of having spoken, having claimed herself, having broken free of the silence that had been her prison. She moved to the small window that looked out over the mews behind the house and pressed her forehead against the cold glass, trying to calm her breathing, trying to think through what would happen next. The Duke was downstairs, had come to the house, had asked about her by name, and she did not know whether to feel gratitude or horror because his attention had protected her and endangered her in equal measure. Below in the drawing-room, Sebastian Wentworth sat with his usual composure and watched Lady Whitmore's face as she entered, noted the high colour in her cheeks and the way her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts, and knew that something significant had just occurred, though he could not yet determine what. Lord Whitmore followed his wife into the room, his expression guarded, and Lydia positioned herself on the sofa with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Your Grace," Lady Whitmore said, her voice straining for its usual obsequious warmth. "What an unexpected pleasure. My husband mentioned you had business to discuss." Sebastian smiled blandly, the smile he used when he was maneuvering someone into a position they did not wish to occupy. "Indeed," he said, "though business is perhaps too strong a word, I merely wished to make a courtesy call. We had such a pleasant evening at your dinner party last week, and I wanted to inquire after everyone's health." "How very kind," Lady Whitmore murmured. "We are all quite well, thank you." Sebastian let a small pause develop, a silence just long enough to become slightly uncomfortable, and then he said with perfect casualness, "I do hope Miss Fairfax received the volume I sent. I recalled her mentioning Wordsworth during our conversation at dinner. He lies smoothly. They had never discussed poetry, had barely exchanged 3 words in company, but the Whitmores could not know this, and I thought she might enjoy a handsome edition of the complete works." The silence that followed was exquisite. Lady Whitmore's mouth opening and closing soundlessly, Lord Whitmore's face darkening with suppressed fury, Lydia looking between her parents with growing alarm, and Sebastian waited with an expression of polite inquiry, as though he had asked about nothing more significant than the weather. "Miss Fairfax," Lady Whitmore finally managed, her voice strangled. "How thoughtful of your Grace. I am sure the girl— that is, I am sure Miss Fairfax was quite surprised by your generosity." "The girl, or Miss Fairfax?" Sebastian asked gently, his tone mild but his eyes sharp. "I confess I am uncertain which form of address you prefer, though I myself favor the latter as it seems more, shall we say, respectful." Lady Whitmore's smile was a rictus of social necessity. "Of course, Miss Fairfax," she said, stumbling over the name as though it were in a foreign language. She was most surprised, most grateful. "I imagine she was," Sebastian replied. "It is a handsome edition, bound in green morocco. I selected it myself from Hatchard's. I do hope she enjoys it. Wordsworth has always seemed to me a poet who speaks to the soul of those who have experienced both beauty and loss." He let that observation hang in the air, waited with implications, and watched Lord Whitmore shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Your Grace is too kind to take notice of our household staff," the older man said, his voice gruff. "On the contrary," Sebastian said, his voice cooling by several degrees, "I believe it is a mark of a gentleman's character how he treats those in positions of service. And Miss Fairfax struck me during dinner as a woman of some education and refinement. One wonders how she came to be in service at all. The question was a rapier thrust, precise and lethal, and Sebastian saw Lord Whitmore's face go pale, even as Lady Whitmore's flushed darker. "She is our distant cousin," Lady Whitmore said stiffly. "Orphaned young. We took her in out of Christian charity when she had nowhere else to go." "How very generous," Sebastian murmured, "and I trust she is grateful for such benevolence." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, and Sebastian rose with fluid grace, judging that he had accomplished what he came to do, had forced them to acknowledge Arabella by name, had made clear that her existence was known to him and mattered to him, had put them on notice that she was not as invisible as they wished her to be. "I shall not take up any more of your valuable time," he said, bowing to Lady Whitmore with perfect courtesy. "Please do convey my regards to Miss Fairfax. I hope the volume brings her pleasure." He departed with the same calm authority with which he had arrived, and in his wake he left a household in turmoil. Lady Whitmore White lipped with rage, Lord Whitmore pouring himself a large brandy despite the early hour, and Lydia demanding to know what was happening and being told sharply to be quiet. Upstairs in her attic room, Arabella heard the front door close, heard the Duke's carriage pull away, and she sank down onto her narrow bed with her head in her hands, shaking with reaction to everything that had happened in the space of an hour. She had spoken her truth, had claimed her name, had been struck and threatened and saved all at once, and she did not know what would come next. But she knew with absolute certainty that she could not go back to silence, could not return to being the invisible girl who had forgotten her own name. The book was gone, confiscated by Lady Whitmore, but the fact of it remained. The Duke had sent her something beautiful, had called her by name, had noticed she existed, and that could not be taken back, no matter what happened. She touched her burning cheek where Lady Whitmore had struck her, and felt not pain, but a strange, fierce joy, because the slap was proof that she was real, that she had impact, that she could no longer be ignored or erased. "Arabella Fairfax," she whispered to herself in the gathering dusk. "My name is Arabella Fairfax, and I exist." Arabella could not sleep, had not truly slept since the morning of the book and the confrontation, and the Duke's strategic appearance in the drawing-room 3 days ago, and she lay in her narrow attic bed, watching the moonlight creep across the sloped ceiling, and felt the restless energy that came from having broken a decade of silence, and discovered that the world had not ended, that she was still breathing, still existing, still somehow intact, despite having shattered every rule that had governed her survival. Lady Whitmore had not dismissed her, had not carried through on her threat to turn her out without references, and Arabella suspected this was because the Duke's pointed inquiries had made it clear that Arabella's invisibility was no longer guaranteed, that her mistreatment might have consequences beyond the walls of the Whitmore household. The book had disappeared, confiscated, and presumably destroyed, but its ghost remained. The fact of it, the Duke's recognition of her name and her worthiness to receive beautiful things, and she found herself returning again and again to the moment when she had held it in her hands, had felt the quality of the leather, had read the inscription, "For Miss Arabella Fairfax, who deserves beautiful things." She rose finally when the clock in the hall below struck midnight, unable to bear the confines of her small room any longer, and she pulled on her wrapper over her plain cotton nightgown and took the candle from beside her bed, shielding the flame with her hand as she descended the servants' stairs on bare feet that made no sound on the worn wood. She knew where she was going, though the knowledge felt dangerous, felt like another transgression in a week that had been full of them. But she could not stop thinking about what she had said to Lady Whitmore. My inheritance could have supported me for life. Where did my mother's money go? And she wanted proof. Needed proof, needed to see with her own eyes what had become of the £8,000 that should have been hers. The library was on the ground floor, a room she was permitted to enter only to dust and sweep, never to read or linger, and it was Lord Whitmore's domain, filled with his ledgers and correspondence and the accumulated books of 3 generations of Whitmores who had been more interested in appearing cultured than in actual learning. She turned the handle slowly, wincing at the small click of the latch, and slipped inside, closing the door behind her with infinite care. The room was silver with moonlight streaming through the tall windows that faced the garden, and the leather spines of hundreds of books gleamed dully in the pale light. And for a moment, Arabella simply stood there, breathing in the scent of old paper and dust and furniture polish, feeling like a thief in a place that should have been available to her, that would have been available to her if her life had taken the path it was meant to take. She set her candle on the desk and began to search, opening drawers as quietly as she could manage, her hands shaking with nerves and the transgressive thrill of doing something forbidden. Lord Whitmore kept his ledgers in the large bottom drawer. She knew this from cleaning the room, and she pulled them out one by one, running her fingers down columns of numbers that meant little to her untrained eye, looking for her name, for some record of the inheritance, for proof of what had happened to her parents' careful savings. The entries were cryptic, abbreviations and codes that she could not decipher, but she kept searching, turning pages by candlelight, and she was so absorbed in the task that she did not hear the library door open, did not hear the footsteps crossing the carpet, did not know she was no longer alone until a voice spoke from the shadows near the fireplace. "Looking for something in particular?" the voice asked, and it was a gentle voice, a familiar voice, but Arabella's heart still leapt into her throat, and she spun around so quickly she nearly knocked over the candle. The Duke of Ashford stood beside one of the leather armchairs, a book in his hand, and he was dressed informally in shirt-sleeves and waistcoat with his cravat loosened, and even in her panic, Arabella registered that this was the most human she had ever seen him, the most accessible, the careful ducal armour set aside for the private hours of night. "Your Grace," she stammered, rising to her feet and nearly tripping over her wrapper in her haste. "I did not know. I thought everyone was— Forgive me, I should not be here. I will go at once." She moved toward the door, but he raised a hand to stop her, his expression not angry but concerned, curious, and something else she could not quite identify. "Please do not go on my account," he said. "I am the interloper here. I could not sleep and came down to find something to read. I did not mean to startle you." And he paused, studying her face in the candlelight. "But I am curious what brings you to the library at midnight. What were you searching for in those ledgers?" Arabella stood frozen between the desk and the door, her mind racing through possible explanations and finding none that did not reveal too much, that did not make her seem foolish or presumptuous or dangerously naive. She could lie, could claim she was looking for household accounts on Lady Whitmore's orders, but something in his face told her he would know the lie, would see through it, and besides she was tired of lying, tired of hiding, tired of the careful erasure of her own truth. "I was looking for proof," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Proof of what happened to my inheritance, to the money my parents left me. I wanted to see it written down, wanted to understand where it went and how." Sebastian set down his book and moved closer, not crowding her but closing the distance between them until he stood on the other side of the desk, the ledgers spread between them like evidence in a trial. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." And so she did, the words spilling out of her in the silver darkness, the whole story that she had carried silently for 10 years, finally given voice. She told him about her childhood, about her mother Emmeline, who had played the pianoforte and read poetry, about her father Thomas, who had been a gentleman of modest means but careful habits, about how they had both died within a week of the fever when she was 16, and she had been sent to live with the Whitmores, her mother's distant cousins, the only family she had left in the world. She told him about the 2 years when she had been their ward, raised alongside Lydia, educated by the same governess, dressed in muslins and taught to dance and paint and sing, promised a small London season when she turned 18, promised a future that seemed secure, if not brilliant. "I was so young," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I had no one. My parents were dead. The Whitmores were my only family. When Lord Whitmore told me the investments had failed, that the money was gone, I believed him. I had no reason not to. I knew nothing of finance or law or how trusts were managed. I was 18 years old and terrified and completely alone." Sebastian listened without interrupting, his face growing harder with each revelation, and in the candlelight she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the edge of the desk as though he needed to hold on to something solid to keep from doing violence to the furniture, or the walls, or the absent Lord Whitmore. "Did you ever see documentation?" he asked when she paused. "Proof of the failed investments, any legal papers explaining what had happened to the trust?" She shook her head. "No, he said it was too distressing for me to review, that I should not trouble myself with such unpleasant business. He said I should be grateful they were offering me a position in the household, rather than turning me out with nothing, that they would provide for me, that I would always have a home here. What choice did I have? Where could I have gone? I had no money, no other family, no skills beyond what a lady's education provides, which is to say nothing practical, nothing that would allow me to earn my keep. So I said yes. I agreed to become Lydia's maid, and at first I told myself it was temporary, that perhaps the investments would recover, that perhaps Lord Whitmore would restore my inheritance when the family's fortunes improved. But as the months turned into years, I began to understand that I would never see that money again, that I had been quietly and completely dispossessed, and the knowledge of it, the helplessness of it, made me want to disappear entirely. And so I did. I stopped speaking unless spoken to. I stopped using my name. I let them erase me because being erased was easier than fighting a battle I could not possibly win. The tears were sliding down her cheeks now, though she had not meant to cry, had not wanted to appear weak or pitiable, but the relief of telling the story, of giving voice to 10 years of silent grief and rage and resignation was overwhelming, and she could not stop the tears any more than she could stop the words. "I have not said my own name in 10 years, she whispered, "until you asked me to, until you looked at me in the park and asked me what my name was, as though I were a person who deserved to have one, and I could not answer you because I had forgotten, not intellectually but in some deeper way. I had forgotten that I was Arabella Fairfax, that I was my mother's daughter, that I was someone." Sebastian was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "Arabella," he said, and then paused. "May I call you Arabella?" She nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. And he continued. "Arabella, what they did was illegal. If your parents left you an inheritance, it was held in trust. Those funds could not simply disappear without documentation. Trusts are governed by law, by courts, by solicitors who have a legal obligation to act in the beneficiary's interest. Either Lord Whitmore is a spectacularly unlucky investor who can produce records of catastrophic losses, or he is a thief who stole your money and has spent the past 10 years benefiting from your labor without compensation." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and clear and utterly damning, and Arabella felt something shift in her chest, a small fierce flame of hope that she had not allowed herself to feel in a decade. "Even if you are right," she said, her voice shaking, "I have no power, no recourse. I am a servant without references, without connections, without means. Who would believe me if I made such an accusation? Who would listen to my claims against a family of Lord Whitmore's standing?" "I believe you," Sebastian said quietly, "and I am not without influence." He came around the desk then, closing the distance between them, and before she quite understood what he intended, he had taken both her hands in his, and the touch was warm and solid, and utterly devastating in its simple human kindness. "You are not alone any more," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "Arabella Fairfax, you are not a servant, you are a woman who has been grievously wronged, and I intend to help you rectify it. I have solicitors, I have access to court records, I have the social standing to make inquiries that you cannot make, and I will not rest until I understand exactly what happened to your inheritance and what can be done to restore it to you." Arabella stared at him. At this man she barely knew, who was offering her something she had not dared to hope for: justice, restitution, the possibility of reclaiming not just her money, but her name, her identity, her place in the world. And she could not comprehend why he would do this, what she could possibly mean to him that he would involve himself in her troubles. "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing all her confusion and disbelief. "Why do you care what happens to me?" He was quiet for a moment, his thumbs moving gently across her knuckles in a gesture that felt both comforting and intimate. And when he spoke, his voice was very soft. "Because you deserve justice," he said. "Because what was done to you was wrong, and I cannot stand by and allow it to continue unchallenged, because in a world full of people who perform kindness for social advantage, you are genuinely kind, despite having every reason to be bitter, because you have survived a decade of cruelty with your essential self intact, and that takes a strength I find extraordinary. And because—" he paused, his eyes searching hers, "because when I speak your name I see you come alive. I see you remember who you are, and I want you to have the opportunity to be that person fully, without constraint, without fear, without the weight of injustice pressing you down into silence. The tears were coming harder now, tears of grief and relief and something that felt dangerously close to joy. And Sebastian released one of her hands to pull a handkerchief from his pocket and offer it to her with the same gentle courtesy he had shown when he knelt in the dirt to retrieve her fallen shawl in the park. She took it and pressed it to her face, breathing in the scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something citrus. And when she looked up at him again, he was smiling slightly. A small, sad smile that acknowledged the strangeness and intimacy of this midnight meeting. "Arabella," he said, just her name, nothing more. And then again, "Arabella, Arabella," as though he were making up for 10 years of silence, as though he could resurrect her simply by speaking her name enough times. The moonlight painted them both in silver, turned the library into a place outside of time, and Arabella felt the world narrow to just this room, this man, this moment of being seen and known and believed. She had come down here looking for proof in ledgers and accounts, cold documentary evidence of theft. But what she had found instead was something warmer and more dangerous, someone who looked at her and saw not a servant or a victim, but a person, Arabella Fairfax, a woman with a history and a future, a woman who deserved beautiful things. "Thank you," she whispered, inadequate words for the enormity of what he was offering, but the only words she had. "Thank you for believing me, for seeing me, for saying my name as though it matters." "It does matter," Sebastian said fiercely. "You matter, Arabella Fairfax. You have always mattered, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise. And I swear to you that I will do everything in my power to help you reclaim what was stolen from you. Your inheritance, yes. But more than that, your name, your voice, your right to exist in the world as yourself, rather than as someone's invisible servant." They stood there in the silver darkness with their hands joined, and the ledgers spread across the desk like accusations. And Arabella felt herself transformed, felt the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming existing simultaneously in this moment. And she knew that whatever happened next, whatever investigations or confrontations or legal battles lay ahead, she would never again be the invisible woman who had forgotten her own name, because Sebastian Wentworth, Duke of Ashford, had looked at her in a library at midnight and called her Arabella as though it were a prayer, as though her name were the most important word he knew, and she believed him. Spring arrived in London with a rush of green and gold, the squares and gardens suddenly alive with daffodils and early roses, and the transformation of the city seemed to mirror something shifting inside Arabella herself, a gradual unfurling after years of being tightly closed against the cold. Sebastian hired a solicitor the day after their midnight meeting in the library. A discreet man named Mr. Henshaw, who specialized in trust law and had a reputation for both competence and confidentiality. And while the investigation proceeded quietly in the background, Sebastian himself became a frequent visitor to the Whitmore household, appearing with such regularity that even Lady Whitmore's transparent delight at having secured the Duke's continued attention began to curdle into anxiety as she sensed something in his manner that she could not quite identify, some purpose beyond the ostensible courtship of Lydia that made her uneasy. He came for tea and stayed for dinner. He came for dinner and lingered in the drawing-room afterward. He accepted invitations to musical evenings and card parties, and each time he found ways to speak with Arabella, manufacturing small requests that the Whitmores could not refuse without appearing churlish or suspicious. He asked that she bring him tea in the study when he was closeted with Lord Whitmore discussing some fabricated business matter. He wandered into the garden at precisely the hour when she was cutting flowers for the dining table. He expressed interest in borrowing a book from the library and requested that she retrieve it for him because she would know where such things were kept. The Whitmores watched these interactions with growing alarm, but could do nothing to prevent them, without openly acknowledging that they wished to keep Arabella away from the Duke, and such an acknowledgement would require explaining why a mere servant merited such concern, would risk exposing the very situation they had worked so hard to conceal. Arabella found herself living in a state of constant anticipation, never knowing when Sebastian would appear, when she would turn a corner and find him there with some excuse to speak with her. And the conversations that resulted were unlike anything she had experienced in 10 years. He asked her opinion on books, on poetry, on the paintings that hung in the Whitmore drawing-room, and at first she answered haltingly, uncertainly, as though she had forgotten how to engage in genuine discourse rather than simply receiving orders. But gradually her responses grew longer, more confident, and she felt something waking inside her that had been dormant so long she had thought it dead. Her mind, her education, her ability to think and speak and engage with ideas. "Tell me about your childhood," Sebastian said one afternoon in the garden, where he had found her cutting tulips, their heads heavy with spring rain. "What did you love?" The question was so simple and yet so profound, asking not what she had done but what she had loved, asking about joy rather than duty, and Arabella found herself answering with a honesty that surprised her. "I loved reading," she said, arranging the tulips in her basket with care. "My mother and I would read poetry together. We had a favorite seat by the window in our old house. The light was best there in the afternoons. We would take turns reading aloud. Wordsworth especially. She loved Wordsworth, the way he wrote about nature and memory and the relationship between them. She died when I was 16. My father followed a year later. The fever took them both within a week." Sebastian was quiet for a moment, his face grave with sympathy. "You have endured so much loss," he said gently. "We all endure, Your Grace." Arabella replied, "Some of us just have less choice in the matter. Loss comes to everyone eventually. The question is only what we do with it, whether we let it destroy us or whether we find a way to carry it and continue." "Sebastian," he said abruptly, and when she looked up at him in confusion, he continued, "When we are alone, call me Sebastian. You said your name for me. The least I can do is offer mine in return." She stared at him, shocked by the intimacy of such a request, the impropriety of it. "I could not possibly," she began, but he shook his head. "You can," he said. "You are not my servant, Arabella. You never were. You are a woman who has been wronged and whom I am attempting to help, and I would very much like it if, when we speak privately, you would use my Christian name as I use yours." The suggestion hung between them in the spring air, weighted with implications that made Arabella's heart race, and after a long moment she nodded, unable to speak, but willing to accept this small rebellion against the hierarchy that had governed every interaction of her adult life. "Sebastian," she said, testing the name on her tongue, and he smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually reserved features into something warm and almost boyish. "Much better," he said, and then someone called from the house, Lady Whitmore's voice sharp with suspicion, and they both stepped apart as though they had been caught in some transgression far more serious than a conversation about poetry. The visits continued throughout April and into May, and Arabella found herself changing in small but significant ways. She began to take more care with her appearance, not dramatically but subtly, pinning her hair in a softer style that framed her face, standing straighter, meeting people's eyes rather than keeping her gaze fixed on the floor. The other servants noticed, and their response was not jealousy, but quiet support. The cook slipping her extra portions at meals, the housemaids offering to help with her work so she had more time to rest, the butler treating her with a deference that acknowledged her true status as the wronged ward rather than the invisible maid. They had always known the truth of her situation, had always understood that what the Whitmores had done to her was cruel and probably illegal, but they had been powerless to intervene, and now that the Duke himself had taken an interest, They felt emboldened to show her small kindnesses, to acknowledge in gesture what they could not say aloud. Arabella kept wildflowers in a chipped teacup on the windowsill of her attic room, daffodils and primroses and tiny violets that she gathered from the corners of the garden, and sometimes when she woke in the early morning light, she would look at them and feel something that was almost happiness, a lightness in her chest that came from being seen, being spoken to, being treated as though her thoughts and feelings mattered. But underneath the happiness was fear, a growing terror that she tried to suppress, but could not entirely silence, because she was falling in love with Sebastian Wentworth, and she knew with absolute certainty that such a love was impossible, doomed, a fantasy that could only end in heartbreak. He was a duke, one of the most powerful men in England, and she was a penniless servant with a stolen inheritance and a decade of erasure behind her, and even if he helped her recover her money, she would still be gentry at best, a woman of modest means and no particular family, utterly unsuitable as a wife for a man of his rank. She told herself that his interest was purely charitable, that he was helping her because he was fundamentally decent and found her situation outrageous, that the kindness he showed her was the same kindness he would show to any victim of injustice. But there were moments when she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something in his eyes that suggested his feelings might be more complicated than simple benevolence, and those moments terrified her because they gave her hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing she could allow herself. In his own study across London, Sebastian sat with Mr. Henshaw and reviewed the results of the investigation with a growing sense of fury that made his hands shake as he turned the pages of documented evidence. "Your Grace," the solicitor said, his tone carefully neutral, "the evidence is incontrovertible." Lord Whitmore forged documents claiming that investments made on behalf of Miss Fairfax's trust had failed catastrophically. He produced false reports from non-existent firms. He created an entire paper trail of fictional losses, but the money, all £8,000 of it, was in fact transferred directly to his personal accounts over the course of 18 months beginning in the spring of 1848. The funds were used to pay his gambling debts, to maintain the household beyond his means, to purchase jewellery for Lady Whitmore and gowns for Miss Lydia, Miss Tsar. Fairfax's inheritance was quite literally stolen to support the lifestyle of the family that claimed to be providing for her out of charity. Sebastian felt sick with rage, his usual careful control slipping as he absorbed the full extent of the Whitmores' theft and deception. "Can we prosecute?" he asked, his voice tight. "We can," Mr. Henshaw replied. "The evidence is more than sufficient for criminal charges, forgery, embezzlement, fraud. Lord Whitmore would almost certainly be convicted and could face imprisonment, though I must warn your Grace that such a prosecution would be a tremendous scandal. The Whitmores would be utterly ruined socially as well as legally, and Miss Fairfax herself would be subjected to intense public scrutiny. Her personal circumstances would be examined in court. In the newspapers, she would have no privacy, no protection from speculation and gossip." Sebastian was silent, considering the implications. The cost of justice weighed against the cost of mercy. "What is Miss Fairfax legally entitled to?" he asked finally. "The full amount of the original inheritance plus interest calculated at the standard rate over the intervening decade," Mr. Henshaw said, consulting his notes, "which comes to nearly £10,000. Additionally, she could claim compensation for lost wages if we can establish that her position in the Whitmore household was coerced servitude rather than voluntary employment, which the evidence strongly suggests." £10,000. Sebastian thought. Enough to make Arabella independent, enough to give her choices, enough to restore not just her money, but her autonomy, her ability to determine her own future. He thanked Mr. Henshaw and dismissed him with instructions to prepare the documentation, but to take no further action until Sebastian gave the word. And when he was alone in his study, he pressed his hands against his face and tried to understand what he was feeling. This tangle of rage at the Whitmores and protectiveness toward Arabella. And something else, something deeper and more personal that he had been trying not to acknowledge. He was falling in love with her, he realized. And the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying because he had not intended this, had not meant to feel anything beyond the righteous anger of a man witnessing injustice. But somewhere between the park and the library and the garden conversations, he had stopped seeing her as a victim to be rescued, and started seeing her as simply Arabella, a woman of extraordinary strength and intelligence and quiet grace. A woman who made him laugh with her dry observations, who challenged his assumptions, who looked at him as though he were Sebastian rather than the Duke, a person rather than a title. He wanted her, not in the casual way he had occasionally wanted other women, not as a mistress or a temporary amusement, but completely, permanently, as a wife, as a partner, as the person he came home to and shared his life with. And the wanting was so intense, it frightened him because he did not know if she could ever see him as anything other than the Duke, who had helped her, whether she could separate whatever gratitude she might feel from genuine affection, whether the power imbalance between them was too great to ever be fully overcome. The investigation continued, and the spring deepened into early summer, and Sebastian found himself spending more and more time at the Whitmore house, drawn there by the prospect of seeing Arabella, of hearing her voice, of watching her slowly come back to life, like the garden coming back from winter. Lydia noticed, her jealousy obvious in the sharpness of her comments, the way she monopolized Sebastian's attention at dinner, and sulked when he turned the conversation to topics that interested Arabella, literature and philosophy, and the political debates happening in Parliament. Lady Whitmore noticed, too, her anxiety manifesting in increasingly desperate attempts to throw Lydia and Sebastian together, to create opportunities for private conversation, to engineer the kind of romantic scenarios that might lead to a proposal. But Sebastian deflected them all with the skill of a man who had been avoiding ambitious mothers for 15 years. Lord Whitmore was the most visibly uncomfortable, his manner toward Sebastian shifting from obsequious friendliness to wary suspicion, and Sebastian knew the older man sensed danger, sensed that his secrets were no longer secure. But Lord Whitmore could not act on his suspicions without revealing that he had something to hide. And so he remained trapped in a performance of hospitality while his household crumbled around him. One evening in late May, Sebastian requested tea in the study, and when Arabella brought it, he asked her to stay, to sit with him for a moment. And she did, perching nervously on the edge of a chair while he poured for both of them, a reversal of servant and served that made her deeply uncomfortable. "The investigation is complete," he said without preamble, keeping his voice low so it would not carry beyond the closed door. "Mr. Henshaw has found everything we need, documentation of the forged investment claims, records of the money being transferred to Lord Whitmore's accounts, proof that your inheritance was stolen." Arabella's hands trembled as she set down her teacup, her face going pale. "All of it," she whispered. "He took all of it." "All of it," Sebastian confirmed. £8,000 plus interest. You are legally entitled to nearly £10,000, Arabella. You are not penniless. You never were. You were robbed. She pressed her hands to her face, and he saw tears leaking between her fingers. But when she looked up at him, her expression was not defeated, but fierce, determined. "What do we do now?" she asked. And the "we" in that question, the assumption of partnership, made Sebastian's heart clench with an emotion he could not quite name. "Now," he said gently, "we decide how you want to proceed. We can prosecute, can bring criminal charges, can see Lord Whitmore imprisoned for his crimes, but such a course would be public and painful, and would subject you to scrutiny you might find unbearable. Or we can pursue a quieter resolution, can confront the Whitmores privately and demand restitution, can threaten prosecution to force them to return your inheritance without the spectacle of a trial. Either way, Arabella, the choice is yours. I will support whatever you decide." She looked at him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face, and then she said something that took his breath away. "Why are you doing this, Sebastian? Truly, what am I to you that you would invest so much time and effort in my troubles?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, and impossible to answer with anything less than equal honesty, and Sebastian felt himself standing at a precipice, knowing that what he said next would determine everything that followed. "You are," he began, and then stopped, searching for words adequate to the truth. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, Arabella Fairfax, and I am doing this not out of duty or charity, but because I cannot bear to see you treated unjustly, because your happiness matters to me, because you matter to me in ways that have nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with—" He paused, gathering his courage. "Everything to do with how I feel about you, which is more than I should feel and less than I want to say." The confession hung between them like a living thing, and Arabella stared at him with wide eyes, her expression shifting from shock to something that looked almost like pain. "You cannot mean that," she said, her voice shaking. "I am nobody, Sebastian. I am a servant in a house that stole my inheritance. I am a woman without standing or connections or anything to recommend me. You are a duke. You could marry anyone. Why would you?" She broke off, unable to finish the sentence. "Because when I am with you, I feel more myself than I have ever felt in company," Sebastian said simply. "Because you see me, Arabella, not the title or the wealth or the social position, but me, Sebastian, just a man who happens to be a duke, but is still just a man underneath all the trappings. And when you say my name, it sounds like the truth instead of a formality." Arabella was crying again, silent tears streaming down her face, and Sebastian wanted to go to her, to take her in his arms, but he forced himself to remain where he was, to give her space to feel whatever she was feeling, without the pressure of his physical presence. "I am afraid," she whispered, "afraid that this is not real, that I am misunderstanding, that you will realize what a mistake it would be to bind yourself to someone like me, and I will be left more alone than I was before, because I will have let myself hope." "Then let me be clear," Sebastian said, his voice steady and sure. "I am not offering you charity, Arabella. I am offering you my heart. I am in love with you, and whatever happens with the inheritance, whatever you decide about the Whitmores, whatever path you choose for your future, I want to walk it with you if you will have me, not as your benefactor, but as your partner, your equal, your choice freely made." The words settled into the quiet study like a benediction, and Arabella looked at him with an expression of such wonder and terror and tentative joy that Sebastian felt his own eyes prickling with tears he refused to shed. And in that moment, everything hung in balance, the future waiting to be determined by what she said next. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon in early June, and Sebastian arrived at the Whitmore townhouse with Mr. Henshaw and a leather portfolio containing enough documented evidence to destroy the family's reputation and possibly send Lord Whitmore to prison. And as he climbed the steps to the front door, he felt a cold fury settle over him like armor, the kind of ducal authority he rarely deployed, but which came naturally when justice demanded it. The butler showed them into the drawing-room, where Lord and Lady Whitmore waited with expressions that attempted nonchalance, but could not quite conceal their anxiety. and Lydia hovered near the window, looking pale and frightened, sensing that something significant was about to occur, though she did not yet understand what. Sebastian did not sit when invited, did not accept the offer of refreshment, did not engage in any of the social pleasantries that usually preceded business. Instead, he stood in the center of the room with Mr. Henshaw beside him and said in a voice that permitted no argument, "Please send for Miss Arabella Fairfax. Her presence is required for this discussion." Lady Whitmore's face went white and then red, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. And Lord Whitmore blustered, "I fail to see why a servant should be present for a private meeting, Your Grace. Surely whatever business you have with us can be conducted without." But Sebastian cut him off with a look of such cold disdain that the older man fell silent mid-sentence. "Miss Fairfax is not your servant," Sebastian said, each word precise and sharp as a blade. "She is the wronged party in a matter of theft and fraud that I am here to address, and she will be present to hear what I have to say and to make her own decisions about how to proceed. Now send for her immediately, or I will go find her myself." The threat hung in the air, and after a moment of frozen silence, Lord Whitmore gestured sharply to the butler, who departed, and returned moments later with Arabella, her face carefully blank, but her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She entered the drawing-room and stopped just inside the door, and Sebastian saw her taking in the scene, the Whitmores seated on the sofa looking like defendants at a trial, Mr. Henshaw with his portfolio of documents, Sebastian himself standing in a position of authority, and he saw the moment she understood that this was it, the confrontation they had discussed, the reckoning that would determine her future. "Please come in, Arabella," Sebastian said gently, using her Christian name deliberately to establish her status as a person rather than a servant. "And come stand here beside me. You should hear everything that is said." She crossed the room slowly, her worn grey dress incongruous in the elegant drawing-room, and she took her position at Sebastian's side, and he felt rather than saw her draw herself up straighter, felt her gathering her courage like a cloak around her shoulders. "Lord Whitmore," Sebastian began, his voice cold and formal, "I have here documentation proving that you embezzled £8,000 from Miss Arabella Fairfax's trust fund over the course of 1848 to 1849. You forged investment reports. You created false claims of catastrophic losses. You transferred her entire inheritance to your personal accounts and used those funds to pay gambling debts, to maintain a household beyond your means, to purchase luxuries for your family. You then coerced Miss Fairfax, who was 18 years old, orphaned and dependent on your goodwill, into accepting a position as a servant in your household under the pretense that her money had been lost through legitimate investment failures. You have for 10 years benefited from her unpaid labor while allowing her to believe she had no other options, no other recourse, that she should be grateful for your charity when in fact you were the one who had stolen her ability to be independent." The words fell into the drawing-room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and horror across the faces of everyone present except Mr. Henshaw, who had heard it all before, and Arabella, who had lived it. Lord Whitmore surged to his feet, his face purple with rage or perhaps fear. "This is outrageous!" he shouted. "Who do you think you are, coming into my home and making these vile accusations? I would never! My investments on behalf of Miss Fairfax were made in good faith, and if they failed, that is the nature of investment, not fraud. You have no right to." But Sebastian's voice cut across his blustering with the authority of centuries of aristocratic power. "I am the Duke of Ashford," he said, and each word was cold as winter. "And I am a magistrate. I have both the social standing and the legal authority to bring these charges. You will address me with the respect my position demands, and you will answer for your crimes. The evidence is incontrovertible. Mr. Henshaw has documentation of every fraudulent transaction, copies of the forged investment reports, records of the transfers to your accounts, testimony from bank officials and clerks. You are caught, Lord Whitmore, and your only choice now is whether you face these charges in a public court or whether you make immediate and full restitution." Lady Whitmore found her voice then, shrill with desperation. "Crimes," she spat. "That girl has been clothed and fed for 10 years, housed and provided for. If there was any misunderstanding about investments, that is hardly grounds for such dramatic accusations. She has obviously been filling your Grace's head with lies, manipulating your sympathy with tales of mistreatment, when the truth is we have been more than generous to an orphan who had nowhere else to go." Arabella spoke then, her voice quiet but steady, and Sebastian felt a surge of pride at her composure. "As a servant," she said, "earning wages you never paid, living in an attic room barely large enough for a bed, forbidden to speak my own name, forbidden to read the books in your library, forbidden to exist as anything other than an invisible pair of hands to lace your corsets and fetch your shawls. You clothed me in rags and fed me on scraps and called it charity, while you spent my inheritance on jewels and gowns and gambling debts. Do not speak to me of generosity when you stole everything my parents worked to provide for me." The colour drained from Lady Whitmore's face and then flooded back as fury overcame caution. "You ungrateful whore," she hissed. "You have seduced the Duke to destroy us. You have used your availability, your willingness to debase yourself, to turn him against us. This is your revenge for imagined slights, for being asked to contribute to the household that took you in, you manipulative little—" But Sebastian's hand came down hard on the table, the crack of it silencing her mid-sentence. "Madam," he said, and his voice was ice and iron, "I suggest you silence yourself before you say something actionable. Miss Fairfax has manipulated nothing, has seduced no one. I became aware of her situation through my own observations, through witnessing how your family treated her, through asking questions about why a woman of obvious education and refinement was working as an unnamed servant. The evidence speaks for itself. Miss Fairfax's character is not in question. Yours is." The room fell into charged silence, and Arabella turned to look at Lady Whitmore directly, and when she spoke her voice was clear and strong and absolutely certain. "I have seduced no one," she said. "I have simply remembered who I am. I am Arabella Fairfax, daughter of Emmeline Fairfax, née Gardiner, and Thomas Fairfax. I was raised as a lady, educated as a lady, promised a future and an inheritance. You stole my inheritance. You stole my name. You stole 10 years of my life. His Grace has simply helped me reclaim what was always mine, what you had no right to take." Lady Whitmore looked as though she wanted to respond, but could find no words, and Lord Whitmore had sunk back onto the sofa, his earlier bluster completely deflated, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Sebastian allowed the silence to stretch, let the weight of the accusations settle, and then he continued in a voice that permitted no negotiation. "You have 2 choices," he said. "You will restore Miss Fairfax's inheritance in full, the original £8,000 plus interest calculated over 10 years, which brings the total to nearly £10,000. Additionally, you will provide compensation for 10 years of unpaid wages, not as a servant, but as a companion, which was her proper status. Mr. Henshaw has calculated that amount at an additional £2,000. You will transfer these funds to Miss Fairfax within 1 week, and you will provide her with a formal letter acknowledging the debt and its payment. Or," and here his voice dropped even lower, even colder, "I will bring criminal charges of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. I will ensure that every newspaper in London reports the details of your theft. I will see you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and I will use every bit of my influence to ensure that you are socially ruined, that no door in society opens to you ever again, that your name becomes synonymous with theft and cruelty, The choice is yours, but you will make it now." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and Lydia's quiet sobbing from her position by the window. Lord Whitmore looked at his wife, at Sebastian, at Arabella, and in his eyes Sebastian saw the exact moment when he accepted defeat, when he understood that he had no cards left to play, no bluffs that would work, no escape from the consequences of his crimes. "We will pay," he said, his voice barely audible. "We will make restitution as you demand." Sebastian nodded once, sharp and final. "You will," he agreed, "and you will do so without complaint or delay. Mr. Henshaw will provide you with the documentation outlining exactly what is owed and where it is to be transferred. You will sign an acknowledgement of the debt, and if you fail to meet any part of these terms, I will immediately file criminal charges. Am I understood?" "Yes," Lord Whitmore whispered. "Yes, Your Grace. Understood." Lady Whitmore remained silent, her face a mask of impotent rage. But Arabella was not finished, was not satisfied with the financial settlement alone. "Say my name," she said, looking directly at Lady Whitmore, and her voice was steady, but underneath it Sebastian could hear the tremor of emotion, 10 years of silence finally breaking. "I am Arabella Fairfax. Say it. Acknowledge it. Admit that I exist." Lady Whitmore's mouth pressed into a thin line, her eyes glittering with hatred, and she remained stubbornly silent. "Say it," Sebastian repeated, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "Or I walk directly to the magistrate's office and file charges regardless of the restitution. Your choice, madam. Acknowledge Miss Fairfax's name and identity or face prosecution." The ultimatum hung in the air, and Lady Whitmore's face went through several transformations, rage and humiliation, and finally defeated acceptance. And when she spoke, the words seemed to be dragged from her against her will. "Miss Arabella Fairfax." "She said, each word bitter as gall, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. Arabella closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Sebastian saw tears glistening on her lashes, though her expression remained composed. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That is all I ever wanted. To exist, to be acknowledged, to have my name spoken with the respect due to any human being. You took that from me for 10 years, but I have it back now. I am Arabella Fairfax, and I will never again allow anyone to make me invisible." The power in the room had shifted utterly, the Whitmores seated and defeated, Arabella standing tall beside Sebastian, and Mr. Henshaw began laying out documents on the table, the formal agreements that would make the restitution legally binding. Sebastian watched Arabella's face and saw the complicated emotions playing across her features, triumph and grief and relief, and something that looked like exhaustion. The toll of 10 years of injustice finally being acknowledged, but the knowledge that acknowledgement could not undo what had been done, could not restore the lost decade, could not give back her youth or her parents or the life she should have had. Lord Whitmore signed the documents with a shaking hand, his defeat absolute, and Lady Whitmore remained rigid and silent, her dreams of marrying Lydia to a duke dissolving into ash, and Lydia wept quietly by the window, understanding that her family's social position was irreparably damaged even without a public trial, that whispers would spread, that the Duke's sudden coldness toward them would be noticed and speculated about, that their prospects were ruined. When the documents were signed and witnessed, Sebastian gathered them up and turned to Arabella. "You have what you are owed," he said gently. "Your inheritance and your name. What happens next is entirely your choice. You are free, Arabella. You never have to set foot in this house again. You never have to see these people again. You are independent and the world is open to you. She looked at him, at the man who had believed her when she could barely believe herself, who had fought for her when she had no weapons to fight with, who had given her back not just her money, but her voice, her identity, her right to exist. And she felt such overwhelming gratitude and love that she could barely speak around it. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate but having no others. "Thank you, Sebastian." He offered her his arm, and she took it, and together they walked out of the Whitmore drawing-room, leaving the family to their shame and their defeat. And as Arabella crossed the threshold, she felt as though she were walking out of a tomb, emerging from 10 years of burial into sunlight and air and the possibility of a future she could choose for herself. The afternoon light was golden as they descended the steps to Sebastian's waiting carriage, and Arabella paused on the pavement and looked back at the townhouse that had been her prison. And she felt no affection, no nostalgia, only a profound relief that she would never again have to enter it as anything other than a visitor, never again have to efface herself, never again have to pretend she did not exist. Sebastian helped her into the carriage, and they sat in silence as it rolled through the London streets toward his townhouse, where she would stay as his guest until she decided what she wanted to do with her reclaimed life. And Arabella leaned her head against the cushioned seat and closed her eyes and let herself feel everything she had been holding back during the confrontation, the fear and the triumph and the grief for all the years that could never be returned. "You were magnificent," Sebastian said softly, and she opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression of such tender pride that it made her heart ache. "You stood there and claimed yourself, claimed your name. You were so strong, Arabella." "I was terrified," she admitted. "My hands were shaking so badly I thought everyone could see." They could not, he assured her. All they saw was a woman who knew her worth, who refused to be diminished, who demanded the respect she deserved. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I could not have done it without you," she said. "Without knowing you believed me, without your support, I would never have had the courage to stand up to them." "You would have," Sebastian said with quiet certainty. "Eventually, you would have found your voice because it was always there. I simply helped you remember it was yours to use." They sat hand in hand as the carriage carried them toward whatever came next, toward a future that was uncertain, but finally her own to choose. And Arabella Fairfax, daughter of Emmeline and Thomas, woman of independent means and reclaimed identity, allowed herself to hope that the best parts of her life might still be ahead of her rather than lost in the past she could never recover. Arabella had been living in the boarding house for gentlewomen on Russell Square for 3 weeks, and the strangeness of it had not diminished. The profound disorientation of having money and freedom and choices after a decade of having none of those things. And she found herself frozen by the simplest decisions, standing in front of her wardrobe unable to determine which dress to wear because they were all hers, all purchased with her own money, all chosen by her own preference, rather than assigned to her by someone else's judgment of what was appropriate for a servant. The boarding house was respectable if modest, run by a widow named Mrs. Pemberton, who asked no intrusive questions and maintained an atmosphere of genteel propriety, and Arabella's room was small but comfortable, with a window overlooking the square's garden and furniture that was worn but clean. And every morning she woke in the narrow bed and experienced a moment of panic before remembering that she was free, that this was her life now, that she could get up or stay abed as she chose, could read or walk or do absolutely nothing, and no one would criticize her, no one would slap her, no one would tell her she was ungrateful or worthless or invisible. She had purchased new clothes with careful economy, dresses of good quality but simple design, in colors that suited her, soft blues and warm browns, and a deep green that reminded her of the book Sebastian had sent, the book that had started everything. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a stranger, a woman of 32 with amber eyes and chestnut hair streaked with grey, a woman who looked almost respectable, almost like someone who belonged in the world rather than existed on its margins. She had begun the delicate process of reclaiming her place in society, such as it was, visiting old family friends who had known her parents and had wondered what became of Emmeline Fairfax's daughter, and their reactions had been mixed, some welcoming her with tears and embraces, others awkward and uncertain, not quite sure how to treat a woman who had disappeared into servitude and now re-emerged with money, but no chaperone, no family, no clear position in the social hierarchy. She was gentry, yes, a woman of independent means now, but she was also 32 and unmarried. And carrying the taint of scandal, whispers had begun to circulate about the Whitmore household, about money misappropriated and a ward mistreated, and though no names were mentioned directly, everyone seemed to know that Arabella Fairfax was somehow at the centre of it, and that the Duke of Ashford had involved himself in her affairs in a way that raised eyebrows and spawned speculation. Sebastian called on her regularly, arriving in his ducal carriage with flowers and invitations to the theatre, to gallery exhibitions, to afternoon drives in Hyde Park, and each visit left Arabella more unsettled than the last, because she could not reconcile the reality of his continued attention with her certainty that such attention must eventually end, that he would realize what a mistake it would be to bind himself to someone like her, and would withdraw with polite excuses, leaving her more devastated than if he had never shown interest at all. The fear grew inside her like a living thing, fed by 10 years of being told she was worthless, that she had no value beyond her utility as a servant, and no amount of money or new dresses could erase that internalized conviction that she was fundamentally undeserving of love, of happiness, of a future that included someone like Sebastian Wentworth. She began to pull back, to create distance between them with small but deliberate gestures, addressing him as Your Grace instead of Sebastian, declining some of his invitations with vague excuses about fatigue or prior commitments, maintaining a careful formality in their conversations that kept him at arm's length. And she saw the confusion and hurt in his eyes, but could not stop herself, could not risk letting him closer when she knew with terrible certainty that closeness would only make the eventual abandonment more unbearable. The confrontation came on a grey afternoon in late June, when rain streamed down the windows of Mrs. Pemberton's parlour, and Sebastian arrived with roses, pink and white and perfect, and an invitation to a musical that evening at the home of a duchess who was known for her intellectual salons and progressive politics. Arabella received him in the parlour with her hands folded in her lap and her expression carefully neutral, and she thanked him for the flowers with a politeness that was almost painful in its distance. "You have been very kind, Your Grace," she said, "but I fear I must decline your invitation this evening. I am not quite feeling myself. Perhaps another time." Sebastian set the roses on the table with controlled precision and turned to look at her, and she saw frustration flickering across his features. "Sebastian," he said, his voice tight. "You call me Sebastian. We have been beyond formality for months now. Why are you suddenly retreating behind titles and politeness as though we are strangers?" Arabella looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. "I think it is best if we maintain proper formality, Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is more appropriate given our respective positions." The silence that followed was charged with tension, and when Sebastian spoke again, his voice was sharp with hurt and confusion. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded. "Why are you retreating from me?" "I thought, after everything, I thought we had—" He broke off, searching for words. "I thought you felt something for me, as I feel for you." She forced herself to look at him then, to meet those grey eyes that had seen her when no one else did, and she felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, but she would not let them fall. "Because this is not real," she said, and her voice was shaking but determined. "You felt sorry for me, Sebastian. You saw an injustice and you corrected it, as any good man would, as any decent person would. But that is not love. That is nobility, literally. You are a duke doing what dukes do, protecting the weak, righting wrongs. But I will not be your charity case forever. I will not be the poor, mistreated servant you felt sorry for, the project you took on to prove your own goodness." Sebastian stared at her as though she had struck him, his face going pale and then flushing with anger. "Is that truly what you think?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "That I have done all this out of pity, out of some aristocratic obligation to correct injustice? You think I spent months investigating your case, visiting that God-forsaken house, and enduring Lady Whitmore's obsequious attempts to throw her daughter at me, finding every excuse to speak with you, listening to your stories, learning your mind because of duty?" "Yes," Arabella said, forcing the word out, though it felt like swallowing glass. "Or perhaps curiosity. Or perhaps you found the situation novel. A servant who was not really a servant, a woman with education trapped in servitude. It was interesting, compelling even, but interesting is not love. Sebastian, and eventually the novelty will wear off, and you will see me as I truly am, a woman of no particular family, with a decade of servitude behind her and scandal attached to her name. And you will regret ever involving yourself in my affairs." He took a step toward her, his hands clenched at his sides. "You are telling me what I feel," he said, his voice rising. "You are deciding for me what my emotions are and what they mean. You spent 10 years being told who you are by people who wanted to diminish you, and now you are doing the same thing to me, telling me that my feelings cannot possibly be real, that I cannot possibly love you because you have decided you are unworthy of love." "I am being realistic," Arabella shot back, standing to face him. "You are a duke, one of the most powerful men in England. You could marry anyone, any beautiful, accomplished woman of impeccable family. Why would you choose me, a woman who was recently a servant? We do not live in a fairy story, Sebastian. This is reality, and in reality, dukes do not marry penniless orphans with scandal attached to their names." "No," Sebastian said, and his voice was cold now, icy with controlled fury. "We live in reality, and in reality I am in love with you, not with saving you, not with the idea of you, not with the project of restoring your inheritance, but with you, Arabella, with your mind that challenges mine, with your strength that survived a decade of cruelty without becoming cruel yourself, with your kindness that persisted despite having every reason to be bitter, with your laugh that I have only heard 3 times, and I would cross England to hear it again, with the way you say my name as though it means something beyond a title, as though I am Sebastian and not the Duke, as though I am a person and not a position." Arabella felt tears streaming down her face, her composure completely shattered. "You cannot possibly," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Do not," he said, each word clipped and precise. "Do not tell me what I can and cannot feel. You have spent 10 years being told who you are and what you deserve, and all of it was lies. Do not compound that injustice by telling me that my love for you is somehow false or misguided or the product of pity. I know my own heart, Arabella, and I am offering it to you freely, not as a duke to a rescued servant, but as a man to a woman he loves. And if you cannot accept that, if you cannot believe that you are worthy of being loved for yourself rather than pitied for your circumstances, then that is your choice. But do not make it mine. Do not decide for me that I am incapable of genuine feeling." The words hung in the air between them, brutal in their honesty, and Arabella stood trembling with her hands pressed to her face, unable to speak, unable to process the enormity of what he was saying, because accepting it would mean accepting that she was worthy, that she deserved love, that the decade of being told she was nothing had been a lie, and the terror of believing that, of letting herself hope, was almost more than she could bear. "I cannot," she whispered. "I cannot let myself believe this, Sebastian, because if I do, if I let myself love you and trust you and believe that this is real, and then you realize your mistake and leave, I will not survive it. I barely survived the last 10 years. I cannot risk shattering again." His expression softened slightly, the anger giving way to something that looked like pain. "So you would rather push me away now, preemptively, spare yourself potential future hurt by ensuring present loneliness? That is not protection, Arabella. That is cowardice, and I did not think you a coward." The accusation stung because it was true, and Arabella felt a fresh wave of tears, hot and bitter. "Perhaps I am a coward," she said. "Perhaps 10 years of servitude made me one. Perhaps I have learned that hoping for happiness only leads to disappointment. Perhaps I would rather be alone and safe than loved and vulnerable." "Then you have made your choice," Sebastian said quietly, and the resignation in his voice was worse than his anger had been. "I cannot force you to believe in my love, cannot compel you to think yourself worthy of it. I can only offer it and hope you have the courage to accept it. But if you do not, if you choose fear over possibility, then I will respect your decision and remove myself from your life. I will not continue to call on you if my presence causes you distress. I will not subject either of us to this painful dance of advance and retreat." He turned toward the door, and Arabella felt panic rising in her chest, a desperate urge to call him back, to tell him she was sorry, that she did love him, that she was terrified but willing to try. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped behind 10 years of silence and shame, and she watched him walk to the door with her heart breaking and her mouth unable to form the sounds that might stop him. At the threshold he paused and looked back at her, and his expression was devastated, the careful ducal mask completely gone, and she saw naked pain in his eyes. "I love you, Arabella Fairfax," he said. "I love you not because you were mistreated, and I felt sorry for you, but because you are brilliant and strong and kind and real. I love the way you think and speak and see the world. I love who you are now and who you might become if you allowed yourself the freedom to grow beyond the trauma of your past. But I cannot love you into believing you are worthy. That is something you have to choose for yourself. And until you do, there is nothing more I can do." He left, the door closing behind him with a soft click. That sounded like finality, and Arabella sank back into her chair and wept, great racking sobs that shook her entire body, grieving not for what she had lost because she had never truly had him, but for what she had rejected, what she had pushed away out of fear, what she might have had if only she could believe she deserved it. The roses he had brought sat on the table, perfect and beautiful, and already beginning to wilt in the stuffy parlor air, and she looked at them through her tears and felt the full weight of her self-sabotage, the way she had engineered this rejection to prove to herself that she was right, that no one could truly love her, that she was fundamentally unworthy. Outside, the rain continued to fall, grey and relentless, and the room felt unbearably empty, and Arabella sat alone with her tears and her regrets, and the terrible knowledge that she had wounded not just herself, but him, had repaid his love with suspicion and his devotion with dismissal, had told him that his feelings were not real, when the truth was she could not bear to believe they might be. Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned, and asked quietly if Miss Fairfax required anything, tea perhaps, or a cool cloth for her head, and Arabella shook her head mutely, unable to explain that what she required was courage, faith, the ability to believe that she was more than the sum of her wounds, more than a decade of erasure, more than a servant who had forgotten her name. The older woman withdrew tactfully, leaving Arabella alone with her grief, and as the afternoon darkened into evening, and the rain turned the windows into rivers of grey, Arabella Fairfax sat in the respectable boarding-house parlour with her new dresses and her restored inheritance and her reclaimed name, and felt more alone than she had in the Whitmore attic, because then at least she had not known what she was missing, had not tasted the possibility of love, and then thrown it away with both hands out of fear that it could not possibly be real. The flowers wilted further, their petals browning at the edges, and Arabella watched them die and thought that she had done this, had killed the possibility of happiness because she could not believe she deserved to be happy, and the knowledge of it was almost more than she could bear. But she bore it anyway because bearing unbearable things was what she had learned to do, even if what she was bearing now was entirely of her own making, the consequence of her own fear and self-doubt, and the internalized conviction that no one could love Arabella Fairfax because Arabella Fairfax was not worth loving, a lie she had believed for so long that it had become her truth, and breaking free of it felt impossible, felt like asking her to become someone entirely new, and she did not know if she had the strength for that kind of transformation, did not know if she could choose courage over safety, hope over certainty, love over the familiar comfort of loneliness. 2 weeks passed in a fog of misery, and Arabella moved through her days at the boarding-house like a woman sleepwalking, going through the motions of living without any real engagement with life itself, and she told herself repeatedly that she had done the right thing, that pushing Sebastian away had been self-preservation rather than self-sabotage. But the conviction grew more hollow with each passing day until it felt like a lie she was telling herself to avoid confronting the truth, which was that she had rejected love out of fear and was now paying the price in loneliness and regret. She avoided society as much as possible, declining invitations and spending her days reading in her room or taking solitary walks in the square garden, and when she caught glimpses of herself in mirrors, she saw a woman who looked haunted, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness, her face drawn with unhappiness, and she wondered if this was what the rest of her life would look like, financially independent but emotionally isolated, free but utterly alone. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a liveried footman who waited for a response, and Arabella stared at the heavy cream card stock, with its elegant script, in complete bewilderment. Lady Henrietta Tilney requests the pleasure of Miss Arabella Fairfax's company at a ball to be held at Tilney House on Friday the 28th of June, dancing to commence at 9 o'clock, and she read it 3 times before the reality of it penetrated, that she, Arabella Fairfax, with her ambiguous social status and her cloud of scandal, was being invited to one of the season's most prestigious events by a woman known for her impeccable taste and powerful social connections. Her first instinct was to decline, to send the footman back with polite regrets, to avoid the scrutiny and whispers that would inevitably follow her entrance into such elevated company. But as she sat with the invitation in her hands, she felt something shift inside her, a small spark of defiance that had been dormant since the confrontation with Sebastian, but now flickered back to life. She had reclaimed her inheritance and her name, had stood up to the Whitmores and won, had proven that she was not the invisible servant they had tried to make her, and yet here she was, hiding in a boarding-house, letting fear dictate her choices, allowing her internalized shame to keep her from living the life she now had the means and the right to live. No, she thought, no more hiding, No more letting fear win. I will go to this ball, and I will hold my head high, and I will prove to myself and to society that I can exist on my own terms, that I am Arabella Fairfax, and I deserve to occupy space in the world." She sent the footman back with her acceptance, and then sat in stunned silence, wondering what she had just committed herself to. But underneath the terror was a thread of something that might have been excitement, the prospect of reclaiming not just her legal status, but her social one, of stepping back into the world as herself, rather than as someone's invisible servant or charity case. She spent the next 3 days in a flurry of preparation, purchasing a gown of deep blue silk that the modiste assured her was entirely appropriate for a woman of her age and station, not the white or pastel of a debutante, but something richer, more dignified, with a bodice that fitted perfectly and skirts that rustled when she walked. And when she tried it on and looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman who looked almost beautiful, not in the conventional way of youth and innocence, but in the way of experience survived, strength earned, dignity reclaimed. The evening of the ball arrived too quickly, and not quickly enough, and Arabella dressed with trembling hands, arranging her hair in a simple but elegant style, fastening her mother's pearl earrings in her ears. And when she descended to the hired carriage that would take her to Tilney House, she felt as though she were going into battle, armored in blue silk and her mother's pearls, and the fragile but growing conviction that she had a right to be there, that she belonged. Tilney House was ablaze with light, chandeliers glittering through the tall windows, and the street outside was choked with carriages disgorging elegantly dressed guests. And Arabella's courage nearly failed her as she climbed the steps alone, without escort or chaperone, a solitary figure among couples and groups, but she forced herself to keep moving, to hand her invitation to the butler, to be announced in a voice that carried across the entrance hall, "Miss Arabella Fairfax." And she heard the whispers start immediately, saw heads turn, saw fans raised to conceal mouths that were no doubt speculating about who she was and how she came to be there and what her connection was to the Duke of Ashford, whose involvement in her affairs was the subject of considerable gossip. She entered the ballroom with her head high and her shoulders back, channeling every ounce of the courage it had taken to speak back to Lady Whitmore, to claim her name, to demand acknowledgement of her existence. And she saw the reactions ripple through the crowd, some faces registering curiosity, others disdain, a few showing what looked like sympathy or even admiration. And she made her way to the periphery of the room where she could observe without being the center of attention, where she could catch her breath and remind herself that she had every right to be here, that she was not an impostor or an intruder, but a gentlewoman of independent means with as much claim to social respectability as anyone present. The orchestra was playing a waltz, and couples swirled across the polished floor in a kaleidoscope of color, and Arabella watched them with a mixture of longing and loneliness, remembering the dancing lessons of her youth, the brief season she had been promised before everything fell apart. And she wondered what her life might have looked like if her parents had lived, if her inheritance had been protected, if she had been allowed to grow into the woman she was meant to be, rather than forced into the invisible servant she had become. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she did not notice the change in the atmosphere of the room, the way conversations paused and heads turned toward the entrance. And when she looked up to see what had caused the shift, she felt her breath stop in her chest, because Sebastian Wentworth, Duke of Ashford, had just entered the ballroom, and he was scanning the crowd with an intensity that suggested he was looking for someone specific. Their eyes met across the expanse of the ballroom, across the swirling dancers and the clusters of gossiping guests, and Arabella saw the exact moment when he found what he was looking for, when his searching gaze locked onto hers, and the world seemed to contract until there was nothing but the two of them, everything else fading into insignificance, the music and the lights, and the hundreds of people all dissolving into background noise. He moved toward her with single-minded purpose, cutting directly across the ballroom floor without acknowledging anyone who tried to catch his attention, ignoring the greetings called out to him, ignoring Lady Henrietta Tilney herself, who raised a hand to hail him, and Arabella stood frozen as he approached, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it, and when he reached her he stopped and bowed with perfect formality, and said in a voice that was not quite steady, "Miss Fairfax, would you do me the honor of this dance?" She nodded, unable to speak, and placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the floor as the orchestra began a new waltz, and as his arm came around her waist, and they began to move together, she felt tears prickling her eyes because this was what she had thrown away, this feeling of rightness, of coming home, of being seen and known and valued. "I have been miserable without you," Sebastian said quietly, his grey eyes searching her face. "Absolutely miserable, Arabella. These 2 weeks have been the longest of my life." "Sebastian," she began, but he shook his head gently. "Please," he said, "let me speak. I need to say this, and I need witnesses so you will believe me. So you cannot convince yourself later that I was acting out of pity or duty or anything other than love." "Witnesses," Arabella repeated, confused. And then she saw him draw a breath, saw his expression shift into something determined and vulnerable all at once, and he raised his voice slightly, just enough that the couples dancing near them could hear, and the effect rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water, dancers slowing, conversation faltering, attention shifting to the Duke and his partner. "Arabella Fairfax," Sebastian said, and his voice was clear and carrying and absolutely certain. "I love you. I am in love. With you. Not with the idea of you, not with rescuing you, not with the project of restoring your inheritance, but with who you are, with the woman you are, brilliant and resilient and kind beyond measure. You survived a decade of cruelty and emerged with your essential goodness intact. You could have become bitter, and you chose kindness. You could have remained silent, and you found your voice. You could have accepted invisibility, and you demanded to be seen." The music had faltered, the orchestra noticing what was happening, and couples had stopped dancing, were turning to watch, and the entire ballroom was going quiet, conversation dying away, as everyone strained to hear what the Duke of Ashford was saying to the woman in the blue silk gown, and Arabella felt her face flushing hot with embarrassment, and something else, something that felt like hope, breaking through the shell of her fear. "Sebastian," she whispered, "everyone is listening, everyone is watching." "Good," he said, his voice firm. "Let them hear. Let them watch. I want no doubts, no whispers that this is anything less than a love match. I want everyone to know that I am here by choice, that I love you by choice, that I am asking you to marry me, not because I feel sorry for you, but because I cannot imagine spending the rest of my life with anyone else." The ballroom was utterly silent now. You could have heard a pin drop, and Arabella stared at Sebastian with tears streaming down her face, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I am not a perfect man," Sebastian continued, still holding her as they stood motionless in the center of the dance floor. "I can be cold and proud. I have spent my entire life behind walls of ducal reserve. But you see past that to who I truly am. You call me Sebastian and mean the man, not the title. You challenge me and surprise me and make me want to be better than I am. And I see you, Arabella. All of you. The girl who lost everything, and the woman who survived, and the soul who never broke, even when the world tried to break you. I see your strength and your fear and your courage, and I love all of it. I love you completely and entirely, and I am asking you here, Now, in front of every gossip in London, will you marry me? Will you be my wife? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you are worthy of love, that you deserve happiness, that you matter?" Arabella could not stop crying, tears of shock and joy and overwhelming emotion, and she was dimly aware of the ballroom full of witnesses, of the fact that her answer would be heard by hundreds of people and would be discussed across London by morning. But none of that mattered because Sebastian was looking at her with such love, such naked vulnerability, such absolute certainty. And she realized that he was giving her the choice, but doing it publicly, using his social power not to control her, but to protect her, to make it clear that this was not a shameful secret or an inappropriate liaison, but an honorable proposal, a declaration of love that he wanted the world to witness. "You would bind yourself to me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "With all the scandal, all the talk, all the whispers about my past, you would make me your duchess, knowing that society will judge you for choosing a woman who was recently a servant. I would bind myself to you if the entire world stood against us," Sebastian said fiercely. "But I do not think they will, Arabella. Look around. See for yourself." She tore her gaze from his face and looked at the crowd surrounding them, at the hundreds of faces watching, and she saw not the disdain she had expected, but something else. Saw women dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs, saw men smiling, saw even the most notorious gossips looking touched by the romance of it, the Duke declaring his love so publicly, so vulnerably, asking a woman of no particular status to be his wife, not despite her circumstances, but because of who she was. And she realized that Sebastian had been right, that society loved a love story, that his public declaration had transformed her from a scandalous figure into a romantic heroine, the woman who had captured the heart of one of England's most eligible bachelors. "Yes?" Arabella said, and her voice broke, but she forced herself to speak louder, to make sure he heard, to make sure everyone heard. "Yes, God help me, yes, I love you, Sebastian. I think I have loved you since you first asked my name, since you looked at me in the park and saw a person rather than a servant, since you knelt in the dirt to retrieve my fallen shawl, since you said Arabella as though it were a prayer. I love you and I am terrified, but I choose courage, I choose hope, I choose you." The ballroom erupted in applause, spontaneous and thunderous, and the orchestra began playing again, a triumphant waltz, and Sebastian pulled her closer and they resumed dancing, moving together as the other couples joined them on the floor, and Arabella felt as though she were floating, as though the last 2 weeks of misery had been a nightmare, and this was waking up. This was reality. This was the future she had not dared to believe she deserved. "I was so afraid," she whispered against his shoulder, "so convinced that you could not possibly love me, that I was not worthy." "You are worthy," Sebastian said firmly. "You have always been worthy, Arabella. The Whitmores tried to convince you otherwise, but they were wrong. You are extraordinary. You are brave and brilliant and beautiful, and I am the luckiest man in England that you have agreed to marry me." She laughed then, a real laugh, perhaps the 4th time he had heard it, and the sound of it made him smile so broadly that she saw several nearby dancers exchange knowing looks and whispered comments. "We are going to be talked about for weeks," Arabella said. "This will be the scandal of the season." "Let them talk," Sebastian replied. "Let them say that the Duke of Ashford fell desperately in love with a woman of remarkable character and had the good sense to propose before someone else snapped her up. Let them say that he made a spectacle of himself, declaring his feelings in front of half of London. I do not care what they say as long as you are mine." "I am yours," Arabella said, and saying the words aloud felt like another resurrection, another claiming of self. "I am yours, Sebastian, and you are mine, and we will face whatever comes together." "Together," he agreed, and he said her name then, just her name, Arabella, with such tenderness that it made her heart ache in the best possible way. And she understood finally that this was real, that he loved her not because he felt sorry for her, but because of who she was, that she was worthy of being loved not despite her past, but as a complete person who included her past, her survival, her strength, all of it. The waltz ended, and the applause began again, guests congratulating them, Lady Henrietta Tilney sweeping over with tears in her eyes to embrace Arabella and welcome her to the family, as it were, saying that she had suspected something of the sort when the Duke had asked her to ensure Miss Fairfax received an invitation, that she was delighted to have hosted such a romantic proposal, that it would be the highlight of the season. Arabella accepted the congratulations and the embraces with a sense of unreality, still not quite able to believe that she, who had been invisible for 10 years, was now the centre of attention at one of London's most prestigious balls, engaged to a duke, accepted by society not with tolerance but with enthusiasm, and through it all Sebastian remained at her side, his hand at the small of her back, his presence a steady anchor, and every time she looked at him, he was looking at her with such love that she felt her remaining doubts dissolving like morning mist in sunlight. They danced again, and between dances they stood together receiving well wishes, and Arabella noticed that the whispers had changed character, were no longer speculative or malicious, but admiring, romantic, the story of the Duke and the woman he loved enough to propose to, in front of hundreds of witnesses already taking on the quality of legend, and she realized that Sebastian had known exactly what he was doing, had used his social power and his public declaration to protect her from gossip, to make it impossible for anyone to suggest their marriage was anything other than a love match, to give her the shield of his name and his status while making it clear that the choice had been hers, that he had asked and she had accepted, that this was partnership, not rescue. As the evening drew toward midnight and the ball began to wind down, Sebastian drew her out onto a balcony overlooking the garden, and in the relative privacy of the cool night air, he took both her hands in his and said, "I meant every word, Arabella. I love you beyond reason, beyond sense, beyond anything I have ever felt before. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt it, making sure you never forget that you are valued and cherished and loved." "I believe you," Arabella said, and she did, finally, the truth of his love settling into her bones, becoming part of her reality. "And I love you, Sebastian Wentworth. I love you for seeing me when I was invisible, for speaking my name when I had forgotten it, for helping me reclaim not just my inheritance, but myself, for loving me not as a project or a charity case, but as a partner, as an equal, as a woman who is worthy of love." "Always," he said, kissing her hands, her forehead, her lips in a gentle kiss that promised everything. "Always worthy, always loved, always Arabella Fairfax, soon to be Arabella Wentworth, but always, always yourself, the woman I love." The stars were bright above them, and the sounds of the ball drifted through the open doors, and Arabella Fairfax stood in the arms of the man she loved, and felt more herself than she had in 10 years, felt whole, felt real, felt finally and completely seen. And she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever adjustments would be required in becoming a duchess, whatever scrutiny would come from being the woman who had captured the Duke of Ashford's heart, she would face it all with courage because she was no longer alone, no longer invisible, no longer the woman who had forgotten her own name. She was Arabella, and she was loved, and that made all the difference. The wedding took place on a September morning when the countryside around Ashford Hall was painted in golds and russets, the summer giving way to autumn with a gentleness that felt like benediction, and Arabella stood in the small stone chapel that had served the estate for 300 years, waiting to walk down the aisle toward the man who had given her back her name and her voice and her belief that she deserved to be loved. She had chosen intimacy over spectacle, had declined the grand London wedding that Sebastian's position might have demanded, and instead they had invited only those people who truly mattered, Sebastian's close family and friends, a handful of Arabella's rediscovered connections from her childhood, and in a gesture that had made her cry when she proposed it, and Sebastian had immediately endorsed, the servants from the Whitmore household who had been kind to her during her decade of invisibility, the cook and the housemaids, and the butler who had all known the truth of her situation, and had offered what small kindnesses they could within the constraints of their positions. The chapel was filled with late summer flowers, roses and dahlias in shades of cream and pink and gold, and the afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the stone floor, and as Arabella prepared to enter, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the girl who had forgotten her name, about the woman who had reclaimed it, about the wife she was about to become, who would share a name with a man who saw her soul, who spoke her name like a prayer, who had loved her into believing she was worthy of love. She wore a dress of cream silk, simple but elegant, cut in clean lines that suited her age and her character, no virginal white because she was not an innocent girl, but a woman who had survived and earned her happiness, and her hair was dressed with sprigs of rosemary for remembrance and myrtle for love, and her mother's pearls hung at her ears, a connection to the past, to Emmeline Fairfax, who had loved poetry and music, and her daughter. And as Arabella walked down the aisle alone, having no male relative to give her away and choosing to come to Sebastian of her own volition, her own choice, her own free will, she felt her mother's presence like a warmth at her shoulder, a blessing from beyond the grave. Sebastian stood at the altar and watched her approach, and she saw his careful composure cracking at the edges, saw moisture in his grey eyes, saw his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them in front of him. And when she reached him, and he took her hand, his grip was warm and solid and slightly desperate, as though he still could not quite believe she was real, that this was happening, that she had chosen him as he had chosen her. The vicar began the ceremony with the ancient words that had joined couples for centuries, and Arabella listened with half her attention, while the other half was focused on Sebastian, on the way he was looking at her as though she were the only thing that existed in the world, as though the chapel and the guests and even the vicar had faded into insignificance. And she felt the same, felt that everything had narrowed to the two of them, to this moment, to the vows they were about to make. "Do you, Sebastian Edward Wentworth, Duke of Ashford, take Arabella Catherine Fairfax to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The vicar intoned, and Sebastian's voice when he answered was not the cool, ducal tone she had first heard in the park, but something warmer, rougher, breaking slightly with emotion as he said, "I do," as though the two words contained everything he felt, everything he wanted, everything he was promising. When it was Arabella's turn to speak her own, "I do." Her voice was steady and clear, a voice that had been silent for 10 years and now rang out in this sacred space, claiming her choice, claiming her future, claiming the man she loved. And when the vicar directed Sebastian to repeat his vows, when he said, Sebastian, take the Arabella," Sebastian spoke her name with such tenderness, such reverence, such profound love, that Arabella felt tears sliding down her cheeks, felt the weight of all that her name had meant and not meant, how it had been stolen and reclaimed, how it had been forgotten and remembered, how it was now being spoken by the man she loved in front of witnesses as he promised to honor and cherish and love her for the rest of his life. The ceremony concluded, and they were pronounced husband and wife, and Sebastian kissed her with a gentleness that acknowledged the sacred nature of the moment, a kiss that promised everything, patience and passion and partnership. And the small congregation applauded, and Arabella turned to face them as the new Duchess of Ashford, and saw the servants from the Whitmore household in the back pews crying openly, saw Sebastian's family smiling with genuine warmth, saw faces full of joy and approval and the recognition that this was a love match, a true union, not a marriage of convenience, but a meeting of souls. The wedding breakfast was held in the great hall at Ashford, intimate by ducal standards but still elegant, and Arabella moved through it in a daze of happiness, accepting congratulations, embracing old friends, and always aware of Sebastian at her side, his hand at her back, his presence a constant reassurance that this was real, that she was loved, that she had not just survived but had somehow, impossibly, found joy on the other side of suffering. When the formalities were concluded and the guests had moved to the gardens for the remainder of the afternoon, Sebastian drew Arabella into the library, the room where they had first truly spoken, where she had told him her story and he had promised to help her reclaim what had been stolen. And in the golden afternoon light filtering through the tall windows, he reached into his coat and withdrew a leather-bound book. And when Arabella took it and opened the cover, she saw that it was a journal, blank pages waiting to be filled, and on the first page in Sebastian's bold hand was written, Arabella Fairfax Wentworth, her life, her voice, her story. So you never forget, Sebastian said quietly. So the world never forgets. You existed even when they tried to erase you. You had a voice even when they silenced you. You had a story even when they tried to write you out of it. This is yours, Arabella, to fill as you choose, to write your own narrative, to create the record of who you are and who you will become. Arabella pressed the book to her chest, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of it, by what it represented. And when she looked up at Sebastian, she saw him watching her with such love that it took her breath away. Say your name for me, love, he requested, and she understood what he was asking, understood that he wanted to hear her claim herself, claim her full identity as his wife, but also as herself, the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. Arabella, she said, her voice strong and certain. Arabella Fairfax Wentworth, and saying it felt like coming home, felt like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. The girl she had been and the woman she had become, and the wife she now was, all existing together in her full name, her complete identity. The most beautiful words I have ever heard, Sebastian said, and he kissed her again, deeper this time, a kiss that was both promise and celebration, and Arabella felt the last vestiges of her fear dissolving, felt herself fully inhabiting her life, her name, her future. The months that followed were an adjustment, learning to be a duchess, managing a great household, navigating the social obligations that came with Sebastian's position. But through it all, Sebastian remained her anchor and her partner, deferring to her judgment, supporting her decisions, making it clear to everyone that the Duchess of Ashford was not merely his wife, but his equal, his companion, his love. Arabella established a foundation to help young women in situations similar to what hers had been, orphans and wards who were vulnerable to exploitation, providing them with legal assistance and financial support, and most importantly, with advocacy, with someone who would ensure their names were known and their voices were heard. And the work gave her a sense of purpose beyond her personal happiness, a way of transforming her suffering into something that might prevent others from enduring the same. 1 year after their wedding, on a crisp October afternoon, Arabella sat in the library at Ashford Hall with her infant daughter in her arms, a baby girl with Sebastian's dark hair and Arabella's amber eyes, and she was reading aloud from Wordsworth, the poet her mother had loved, the poet whose work had been her comfort during the dark years, and the baby was too young to understand the words, but seemed soothed by the rhythm of her mother's voice. "Once upon a time," Arabella said, deviating from the printed text to tell her daughter a story. "Your mamma forgot her own name. She lived in a house where no one spoke it, where no one acknowledged she existed, and she became invisible. But then your papa came along and he asked her name, and when she could not answer because she had forgotten how to claim herself, he waited patiently until she remembered, and then he said her name. Arabella, and it sounded like a prayer, like the most important word in the world, and your mamma remembered who she was, and now she will make sure you always, always know who you are. You are Emmeline Arabella Wentworth, named for your grandmamma who loved poetry, and you have a name, and you will never forget it. You will never be invisible. You will always know you are loved." She looked up to find Sebastian standing in the doorway watching them, and the expression on his face was so tender it made her throat tighten, and he crossed the room and knelt beside the chair, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand, and then taking Arabella's hand in his other, joining the three of them together. "She will know it," Sebastian said softly. "She will know her name, and she will know she is loved, as you are loved, Arabella, as you will always be loved." "Say it again," Arabella requested, a request she made often, needing to hear her name spoken with love, needing the reassurance that she was real, that she existed, that she mattered. "Arabella," Sebastian said, and he said it like a prayer, like a promise, like a benediction. "Arabella, Arabella, Arabella." And each repetition was a gift, a recognition, a celebration of her existence, and she felt the little girl who had lost everything, and the woman who had survived, and the wife and mother she had become, all existing together in that single name, her name, the most important word in her personal lexicon. "I am here," Arabella whispered. "I exist. I am real." "You are everything," Sebastian replied. "You are my wife, my love, my partner. You are Emmeline's mother. You are the woman who taught me what courage looks like, what resilience means, what it is to survive impossible circumstances and emerge with kindness intact. You are Arabella Fairfax Wentworth, and you will never be invisible again, never be silenced again, never be erased again. I will say your name every day for the rest of our lives if that is what you need to remember that you matter." The baby made a small sound, a contented sigh, and Arabella looked down at her daughter and then up at her husband, and she felt such overwhelming gratitude for this life she had never thought she would have, this family, this love, this peace that was earned rather than given, hard-won rather than inherited. And she knew that the scars of her past would always be part of her, that some wounds never fully healed, but she also knew that scars were evidence of survival, proof that she had endured and overcome, and she would carry them not with shame, but with a quiet pride in her own strength. The library was warm with firelight, and the autumn afternoon was fading into evening, and the three of them sat together in the room where Arabella had reclaimed her voice, where she had told her story, where Sebastian had promised to help her seek justice, and now it was the room where she read to her daughter, where she passed on the love of poetry her mother had given her, where she ensured that the next generation would know their name and their worth, would never have to fight to exist, because their existence would be celebrated from the very beginning. Sebastian picked up the journal he had given her, the one she had been filling with her story, with memories of her parents, with reflections on her years of servitude, with hopes for the future, and he read aloud the entry she had written the night before. "I am Arabella Fairfax Wentworth," she had written, "daughter of Emmeline and Thomas Fairfax, wife of Sebastian Wentworth, mother of Emmeline. Arabella Wentworth, I was erased and I reclaimed myself. I was silenced and I found my voice. I was told I was worthless and I learned I was worthy. I was invisible and I became visible. Not through anyone else's power, but through my own courage and the support of someone who loved me enough to help me remember who I was. This is my story. These are my words. This is my name, and it will never be taken from me again." "Beautiful," Sebastian murmured. "Absolutely beautiful. Your story, your voice, your truth. All of it matters, Arabella. All of it will endure." The fire crackled, and the baby slept, and Arabella leaned her head against Sebastian's shoulder and felt the rightness of this moment, the peace of being exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, loving and being loved in return. And she thought about the title she had been given, Duchess of Ashford, and knew that while it was an honor and came with responsibilities she took seriously, it was not what defined her. She was not the Duchess. She was Arabella, the woman who had been erased and had written herself back into existence, the woman who had forgotten her name and had reclaimed it, the woman who had survived and had chosen to thrive. And that was the story that mattered. That was the identity that endured. Not the title, but the name. Not the position, but the person. Not the Duchess, but Arabella, always Arabella, spoken like a prayer by the man who loved her, remembered by the daughter who would carry it forward, inscribed in the journal that would preserve her story for generations to come. "Say it one more time," she requested, and Sebastian smiled and gathered her closer, and with the baby nestled between them, and the fire warming the room, and the evening settling soft and quiet over the estate, he said her name again and again. Arabella, Arabella, Arabella. And each repetition was a promise kept, a prayer answered, a love confirmed, and she let the sound of it wash over her like absolution, like coming home, like finally being real, being seen, being loved, being Arabella Fairfax Wentworth, who had a name and a voice and a story that would never be erased again, who existed not in the shadows, but in the light, not invisible, but gloriously, triumphantly, permanently visible, a woman who mattered, who was loved, who was everything.